Get
Jolene
back!
Beckett saw the
Stick
black
that!
SUV before
Not
she
hit
should have
me!
cared about it, and then she made the mistake of looking away. That decision almost cost her everything. It was 2:43 in the morning at a truck stop that existed for no reason other than Interstate 40 needed somewhere for the desperate and the weary to pause between Albuquerque and Amarillo. One of those places built from concrete and bad lighting and the collective exhaustion of everyone who'd ever pulled off the highway at an hour when nothing good was happening anywhere. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead like insects counting down the seconds to their own deaths. The air smelled of diesel fuel and old coffee and the particular loneliness that clings to places where nobody stays longer than they have to. Three 18-wheelers idled in the lot, their running lights glowing like tired eyes. A rusted Pontiac with Arizona plates sat near the entrance driver's seat, reclined, occupant invisible. And in the far corner of the asphalt, parked at an angle that gave it a clear sight line to the diner entrance, while remaining half swallowed by shadow, a black SUV with windows tinted so dark they looked like wounds cut into the body of the vehicle. Engine off, no interior light, no movement, just sitting there with the patience of something that had learned to wait. Jolene had clocked it the moment she rolled in 97 minutes ago, her Harley's engine dropping from a roar to a growl as she eased into a spot near the diner door. Old habit. 15 years wearing a Hells Angels patch taught you to catalog your surroundings the way other people check the weather. Vehicles that didn't belong. Faces that appeared twice. Exits, angles, lines of retreat. You didn't survive the life she'd lived by trusting that the world was safe. You survived by assuming it wasn't and preparing accordingly. The SUV was wrong. She'd known that from the first glance. Too clean for a truck stop at this hour, windows too dark for legitimate travel, positioned with the kind of deliberate geometry that spoke of training rather than convenience. Someone inside that vehicle was watching something, or waiting for something, and neither option was comforting at 2:43 in the morning in the middle of the New Mexico desert. But Jolene's mind was 340 miles away, tangled in a courthouse she wouldn't enter, for another 6 weeks trapped in a custody battle that had consumed the last 3 years of her life and showed no signs of releasing her. Darcy, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile and auburn hair that exploded in every direction regardless of how many clips and bands and prayers you threw at it. Standing in the lock screen photo on Jolene's phone wearing an oversized Hells Angels shirt like a nightgown, grinning in front of the Harley with the fearless confidence of a child who had never been given a reason to doubt that the world would catch her when she fell. 6 weeks until a family court judge decided whether that little girl spent her childhood with a grandmother who would die for her or a father who couldn't stay clean long enough to remember her birthday. Jolene swung off the Harley with the practiced ease of someone who'd been mounting and dismounting motorcycles for longer than some people had been alive. Her boots hit asphalt. Her knees complained. 58 years of hard living made themselves known in joints and tendons, in the particular stiffness that settled into your lower back after 400 miles of desert highway. She stretched, felt vertebrae pop like small surrenders, and headed for the diner without looking at the SUV again. That was the mistake. Not the only one she'd make tonight, but the one that started the chain. The diner door had a brass bell on a spring that chimed when she pushed through. Cheerful sound, completely wrong for the hour and the emptiness and the weight she was carrying. 2 truckers hunched over the counter like men praying to coffee. A waitress behind the register who looked like she'd started her shift sometime during the previous administration and hadn't found a reason to stop. Cook visible through the service window, cigarette balanced on his lower lip in direct violation of every health code the state of New Mexico had ever written. Jolene slid into a booth by the window. Not because she wanted to watch her bike, because some part of her, the part that had kept her alive through bar fights and bad deals and one particularly ugly night in Tucson that she still carried like a stone in her chest, that part wanted eyes on the parking lot, on that SUV that hadn't moved in 97 minutes, on the darkness that felt thicker than it should. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She pulled it out with hands that told stories she'd never share with strangers. Scarred knuckles from fights she'd won and a handful she'd lost. Calluses layered over calluses from decades of gripping handlebars through desert heat and mountain cold, and the kind of rain that turned highways into rivers. A thin white line across her right index finger from the night she'd learned that broken bottles didn't care about your intentions. The text message glowed on the screen. 3 words from the only person in the world who could make Jolene Beckett's chest feel like it was being squeezed by something she couldn't fight. Grandma, when you home, no punctuation, no emoji, just the raw, unfiltered need of a 7-year-old who didn't understand why the most important person in her world kept leaving. Jolene's thumb hovered over the keyboard, started to type, stopped, started again, deleted the letters one by one. The truth was she didn't know when she'd be home. Didn't know if this ride to nowhere was running from something or toward it. The custody hearing was 6 weeks away, and her lawyer had been very specific about what Jolene needed to do in those 6 weeks. Stay visible, stay clean, stay away from anything that could be photographed, recorded, or testified about in a courtroom. Be the grandmother the judge wanted to see, not the biker the newspapers wrote about. Harlon had a lawyer who knew exactly how to weaponize respectability, who could stand in front of a judge and paint Jolene as a danger to her own granddaughter, a violent woman from a violent world who had no business raising a child in a home where motorcycle engines rattled the windows and men with criminal records ate dinner on weeknights. Never mind that Harlon Beckett, 35 years old, her son, her firstborn, the baby she'd held against her chest and promised the moon, had a felony possession charge and 3 failed rehabilitation attempts and a habit of disappearing for weeks at a time into whatever chemical oblivion meth provided. Never mind that the last time Darcy had been left in Harlan's care, the neighbors had called the police because a 7-year-old was sitting on the front porch at midnight alone in February, waiting for a father who'd forgotten she existed. The law wasn't always logical, and lawyers who charged $400 an hour had a way of making logic irrelevant. She pocketed the phone without responding. Some conversations required more than text, required looking into those bright hazel eyes and explaining why the world was built on uneven ground, why the people who were supposed to protect you sometimes became the people you needed protection from. The waitress materialized beside the booth, 60-something with a name tag that read Nadine, and a face that had processed more human misery across a Formica counter than most therapists saw in a career. Coffee Hun Jolene's voice came out rougher than she intended. Years of desert wind and engine noise and shouting over music in clubhouses had sanded her vocal cords down to something that sounded like gravel being dragged across concrete. Nadine poured without asking about cream or sugar. Good instinct. Read the customer. Woman alone at a truck stop at 3 in the morning with blood-crusted knuckles and a leather vest covered in patches that most people cross the street to avoid. She didn't want cream and sugar. She wanted caffeine strong enough to keep her upright and something warm to wrap her hands around while the ghost circled. "You all right, sweetheart?" The question carried no judgment. Just the tired kindness of someone who'd served coffee to the running and the broken for longer than some of these truckers had been driving. Jolene managed something that might have qualified as a smile under better circumstances. Just taking the long way home. Nadine's expression said she'd heard that line before and believed it about as much as she believed the cook when he swore he'd quit smoking. But she moved on without pressing. Some people wanted to talk. Some people wanted to be left alone with whatever they were carrying. The good ones could tell the difference. Jolene wrapped both hands around the mug. Heat seeped through ceramic into skin, grounding her in the present, pulling her back from the courthouse in her head, and the little girl 340 miles away, who was probably asleep by now, hopefully asleep curled up in the bed Jolene had bought her with the quilt Jolene had made from scraps of old shirts, because Darcy liked sleeping under things that smelled like home. Her gaze drifted back to the window, past her Harley sitting under the sodium lights like a loyal chunk waiting for its owner, past the idle trucks in the silent Pontiac, to the far corner of the lot where that black SUV sat in the shadows, still unmoving, still patient, still wrong in ways that Jolene's survival instincts were trying to articulate, but her exhausted mind kept overruling. Something about the angle, the way it was positioned for a clear line of sight to the diner entrance, but tucked behind a concrete barrier that broke up its silhouette from inside. Professional geometry, tactical placement, the kind of setup she'd seen before in a different context, a different decade, but with the same cold architecture of people who were very good at waiting for exactly the right moment to do something irreversible. Her hand moved to her belt, to the knife she'd carried for 15 years, 7 inches of steel that had opened boxes and cut rope, and once in a parking lot outside Bakersfield, convinced 3 men that they'd made a serious error in judgment about which woman to corner at closing time. The weight of it against her hip was familiar, comforting, entirely insufficient against whatever was inside that SUV, but better than empty hands. She wasn't afraid. Fear was something she'd stopped being able to afford around the same time she buried her husband, watched her son dissolve into addiction, and found herself standing in a hospital nursery at 51 years old, looking through glass at a newborn girl with furious red cheeks and fists clenched against a world she hadn't asked to enter. Fear required energy that Jolene had redirected years ago into something more useful. Vigilance, preparation, the grim determination of a woman who'd lost enough to know exactly what she was willing to do to keep from losing more. She took a long pull of coffee. It tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous century, but the bitterness cut through the fog of exhaustion and brought her senses into sharper focus. Whatever was sitting in that SUV, she'd handle it. She'd handled worse. What she was not prepared for, what no amount of vigilance or experience could have anticipated, was the boy. Kip Renner had been invisible for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. 3 months living entirely on the street, and before that, nearly 2 years bouncing between shelters and group homes and the temporary mercies of strangers who helped for a night, but couldn't help for a lifetime. Learning the architecture of survival that nobody taught in school. Be quiet, be small, occupy the spaces that other people's eyes slid past without registering. Perfect the art of human camouflage until you move through the world like a rumor present, but unconfirmed there but never quite real enough to demand attention. He was 11 years old and he'd become very good at being nothing. Tonight he was wedged into the narrow gap between a dumpster and the cinder block wall behind the truck stop's kitchen. The smell was terrible rotting food and rancid grease, and the sour undertone of things decomposing in the October heat that lingered even after the sun went down. But the smell was also protection. Nobody came back here voluntarily. Nobody wanted to investigate the source of that particular stench, which made it perfect for a boy who needed to exist in the margins where the world's attention didn't reach. His backpack sat between his feet. Everything he owned compressed into a school bag with a broken zipper that he'd found in a donation bin outside a church in Las Cruces. One t-shirt that used to be white before the road and the weather and the accumulated grime of homeless life had turned it the color of dishwater. A pair of jeans held together more by habit than fabric. Socks so thin they were practically theoretical. A cracked phone with no service plan that he kept because the photos on it were the only evidence that his old life had been real, that he'd once had a mother and a sister and a kitchen with yellow curtains and cereal in the morning. And buried at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep it safe from rain and sweat and the damp that crept into everything when you slept outdoors, a photograph he couldn't look at but couldn't throw away. Norah, 8 years old in the picture, which meant she was 11, now the same age as Kip. Dark hair in 2 braids, front tooth missing. Wearing the purple hoodie she'd refused to take off for 3 straight weeks because their mother had bought it at a yard sale and told her it was the color of Queens. In the photo, she was laughing at something outside the frame, head thrown back, mouth wide open, completely unguarded, in the way that only children who still trusted the world could be. She was somewhere in the foster system now, being raised by strangers in some house Kip had never seen, in some city he didn't know, sleeping in a bed that wasn't hers, surrounded by people who might be kind or might be indifferent, but either way weren't family. 3 years since they'd been separated. 3 years since Kip had stood frozen in their kitchen while Croy, their stepfather, beat their mother with the kind of focused mechanical violence that suggested he'd done it so many times it had become routine. While Norah screamed from behind the kitchen table, hands clamped over her ears, begging someone, anyone, to make it stop. While Kip's feet welded themselves to the linoleum and his voice died somewhere between his lungs and his throat, and his entire body locked up like someone had severed the connection between his brain and his muscles. He just stood there, 11 years old, in a doorway, with his mother's blood on the floor 6 feet away, and his sister screaming his name, and his stepfather's fists rising and falling with metronomic regularity, and Kip hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done a single thing to change what was happening. The social worker came the next day, took one look at the broken furniture, the holes in the drywall, the dried blood that nobody had cleaned up because there was nobody left who cared enough to clean. Norah was young enough, undamaged enough on the surface, easy enough to place. A sweet girl, braids and a purple hoodie, and a smile that could still light up a room if you gave it reason to. Foster families wanted daughters like Norah, wanted the project of healing a child who was still soft enough to heal. Kip was 11, old enough to be labeled difficult, old enough to have witnessed things that made adults uncomfortable when they read the case file, old enough that prospective foster parents looked at him and saw trajectory instead of possibility, saw statistics about boys from violent homes who grew into violent men, saw risk instead of a kid who just needed someone to stand between him and the darkness. So Norah went to strangers who promised to love her. And Kip went back to Croy because the system in its infinite mechanical wisdom determined that one parent with a temper was better than no parents at all. He lasted 4 months. 4 months of walking on eggshells and sleeping with one eye open and learning to read Croy's moods, the way sailors read weather, watching for the atmospheric shifts that preceded violence. 4 months of eating whatever was in the refrigerator when Croy wasn't looking and wearing long sleeves to school to cover bruises and telling teachers he was fine. Everything was fine, he was just tired. Then he ran, climbed out his bedroom window on a Tuesday night in January with nothing but the clothes on his back and Norah's photograph in his pocket and the absolute certainty that staying was going to kill him. Spent the first year in shelters that had rules about how long you could stay. Spent the second year in group homes that smelled like bleach and felt like waiting rooms for lives that never arrived. Spent the last 3 months entirely outdoors after the last shelter told him there wasn't space. Sorry, kid, try again next week, and next week never came. Now here he was, behind a dumpster in New Mexico, October cold settling into his bones through a hoodie so thin it was barely more than a suggestion of warmth. Stomach cramping around its own emptiness, because the last thing he'd eaten was half a gas station sandwich he'd found in a trash can 14 hours ago. Trying to remember what it felt like to sleep without one eye open, to exist in a space where the next threat wasn't always 20 minutes away. He was good at not thinking about things, good at pushing the memories and the hunger and the bone-deep exhaustion of never being safe down into a place where they couldn't reach him. Good at shrinking his needs until they fit inside a broken backpack. Good at being overlooked, which was exactly why he noticed things that other people missed. The black SUV had been there when he'd arrived 2 hours ago, scouting for a safe corner to spend the night. He'd cataloged it immediately. Survival arithmetic. Every vehicle in a parking lot told a story if you knew how to read the language. Trucks with running lights meant sleeping drivers safe to be near. Cars with fogged windows meant couples or people getting high, unpredictable, but usually harmless. Vehicles that sat dark and still with tinted windows at 3 in the morning meant something else entirely. The SUV was wrong. He'd almost moved to a different location, found somewhere else to fold himself into the gap between the world's attention and its indifference. But then the woman on the motorcycle had arrived and something made him stay. She'd rolled in alone on a Harley that sounded like controlled thunder, the engine's growl settling into the parking lot silence with authority. Older woman, maybe the age his mother would have been if she'd lived. Gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a tight knot. Leather vest heavy with patches that even from a distance Kip recognized. Hell's Angels. The people news anchors warned you about. The ones who supposedly dealt drugs and started fights and existed on the wrong side of every line society drew between acceptable and dangerous. But Kip had been a ghost long enough to see what people didn't mean to show. And what he saw when the woman dismounted was the way she checked her phone before anything else. The way her shoulders dropped half an inch when she read whatever was on the screen, like a weight she'd been carrying had just gotten heavier. The way her thumb lingered on the glass for a long moment before she pocketed the device with the careful deliberation of someone putting away something fragile. That was a mother's gesture, or a grandmother's. The motion of someone who carried photographs of people they loved, the way Kip carried Norah's picture like a talisman against despair. Like proof that somewhere in the world there was a reason to keep going. She'd gone into the diner, sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee from the waitress, wrapped both hands around the mug, and stared out at the parking lot with eyes that were looking at something much farther away than asphalt and sodium lights. And that's when the SUV woke up, not the engine, the doors. They opened in perfect synchronization. Driver's side and passenger side moving together with the kind of coordination that didn't happen by accident. Two men stepped out into the darkness, average height, dark clothing, forgettable faces, moving with a fluidity that spoke of rehearsal of plans discussed and refined and executed so many times that the individual steps had become automatic. They didn't talk, didn't stretch or yawn or check their phones, or do any of the mundane human things that people did after sitting in a vehicle for 2 hours. They simply moved. One drifted left, one drifted right, creating an angle of approach that converged on the diner entrance in a slow, patient arc designed to cut off escape routes before the target even realized escape was necessary. Kip's entire body went cold. Not the October cold that had been gnawing at him through his thin hoodie, something deeper. The cold of recognition, the cold of having seen choreography like this before in a different kitchen, in a different life, with different actors performing the same terrible dance. Predators. He'd watched enough nature documentaries in shelters and group homes to recognize the geometry, the way wolves separated prey from the herd, the way lions created angles that gave the quarry nowhere to run. Patient practiced lethal in their coordination. His heart started hammering. Blood rushing loud enough that he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the truck stop. Every survival instinct he'd developed over 3 years on the street was screaming at him to stay down, stay quiet, stay in the gap between the dumpster and the wall where nobody could see him, and nothing that happened in that parking lot was his responsibility. This was not his business. Whatever was about to happen to the woman in the diner was not something an 11-year-old homeless boy could change or should try to change. He had no weapon, no phone that worked, no size, no strength, no authority, no reason to believe that inserting himself into a situation involving armed men would produce any outcome other than his own destruction. The right-hand man's jacket shifted as he walked, fabric pulling across something heavy tucked against his ribs. Kip knew that shape, had memorized it 3 years ago in a kitchen with blood on the floor, and Croy waving a pistol at the social worker barrel-catching fluorescent light as it swung in wild arcs, slurring threats about how nobody was taking his kids, while their mother bled from a split lip and Norah sobbed behind the table, and Kip stood in the doorway unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except exist as a witness to his own uselessness. The memory hit him like a physical blow, sudden and total and so vivid he could smell the blood, could hear Norah's voice cracking on his name, could feel the paralysis spreading through his muscles like poison locking him in place while the world burned. The man's hand disappeared inside his jacket, fingers curling around something metallic. The parking lot was full of noise. Idling engines, buzzing lights, the distant white noise of highway traffic. But to Kip, everything went silent. Sound draining from the world like water from a cracked glass. All he could see was the woman in the diner, head bent over her coffee, back to the door, completely unaware that she was 30 seconds from dying. Stay down, the survival voice, the one that had kept him breathing for 3 years, hissed in his head with the authority of absolute self-preservation. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. This is not your fight. Nobody ever fought for you. Nobody stepped between Croy's fists and your mother. You screamed for help, and the walls absorbed the sound, and nothing changed. Why should you be different? His fingers found Norah's photograph through the fabric of his pocket, felt its edges softened by years of handling, and he heard her voice, small and desperate, and absolutely certain that her brother could save them both if he just tried. Kip, do something. Please do something. The man's gun cleared his jacket, black metal reflecting the sodium lights in dull orange flashes. Barrel rising towards the diner window, toward the woman who had no idea that the last ordinary moment of her life was already over. 3 years of silence broke. Kip's legs moved before his brain caught up, before fear could lock him down the way it had in that kitchen, before the survival voice could convince him that staying hidden was the same as staying alive. He exploded out of the shadows behind the dumpster, sneakers slapping pavement, arms pumping, heart trying to break through his rib cage, voice ripping out of his throat in a sound that was part warning and part war cry, and part the accumulated rage of a boy who had spent 3 years hating himself for standing still. Gun. The word came out cracked and raw. 11-year-old vocal cords straining against a volume they were never designed to produce. But it cut through the night, cut through the ambient noise and the buzzing lights and the white noise of the highway. Cut through everything with the jagged, unmistakable clarity of a human being screaming because their life depended on it. The shooter's head snapped toward the sound, expression shifting from focused calm to confused irritation. Gun swinging away from the diner window, tracking toward the source of the scream, toward the small figure hurtling across the asphalt with nothing but momentum and desperation. Inside the diner, the woman's head jerked up, eyes wide, body already moving. The shooter's finger found the trigger. Kip heard the shot before he felt it, a sharp crack that echoed off concrete and metal and seemed to bounce between the trucks before scattering into the desert sky. Somewhere behind him, birds exploded off power lines. A truck alarm began to wail. Then fire, white-hot detonating through his left side just below the ribs. The impact spun him sideways, feet tangling the world, tilting at an angle that his brain couldn't reconcile with gravity. Asphalt rushed up and met him with the indifferent brutality of hard surfaces meeting soft bodies. He hit shoulder first, then hip pain cascading through him in the waves that each one arrived worse than the last. For half a second, he thought he had just fallen, tripped over his own feet in the dark the way he had 100 times before. Maybe the shooter had missed. Maybe this was just the shock of pavement against bone and the rush of adrenaline creating sensations that felt like injury but weren't. Then the warmth started, spreading outward from his left side, soaking through his hoodie, pooling beneath his back, with a patience that felt almost gentle compared to the violence that had created it. Warm and wet and wrong in a way that his body understood before his mind caught up. He'd been shot. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. His vision softened at the edges, the parking lot lights smearing into halos of sick yellow. Above him, the sky was enormous and empty, and full of stars that didn't care about a boy bleeding on asphalt in the middle of New Mexico. But he'd done it, for the first time in 3 years, when it mattered, when a gun was pointed at someone who deserved better than a bullet. Kip Renner had moved, had screamed, had thrown his body between violence and its target, and refused to stand frozen in the doorway while someone else paid the price for his paralysis. He'd finally done something. Blood roared in Jolene's ears, louder than the gunshot that was still echoing across the parking lot, louder than her own heartbeat, louder than the scream that she realized after a disoriented second was coming from her own throat. She'd been raising the coffee mug to her lips when the boy's voice shattered the night. One word, gun, and 15 years of instinct took over before conscious thought had time to form an opinion. She dropped below the window-lined coffee, exploding across the booth, ceramic shards scattering, hit the floor on her belly and rolled, came up in a crouch beside the diner door with the knife already in her hand. The second shooter came through the entrance. Too fast, too committed. He'd been approaching from the left flank, heard the shot, heard the commotion, and instead of retreating to the SUV like a professional should have, he'd accelerated his approach, trying to finish the job while chaos provided cover. Mistake. Jolene launched from the crouch, low, compact, brutal, all 58 years and 135 pounds of her channeled through her shoulder as it connected with his solar plexus. He was bigger, younger, stronger on paper. But Jolene had been hitting people since before this man was born, and she knew something that size and youth couldn't teach you. Leverage beats strength. Surprise beats speed. Commitment beats everything. His shot tore into the ceiling. Plaster and dust rained down. The gun spun from his grip as they hit the floor, together, Jolene on top. Knife already moving. Not to kill. She was past the age of killing if she could avoid it. Just a quick, deep kiss of steel across his forearm, blade parting skin and muscle with surgical precision, finding the tendons that controlled his grip. He screamed, curled around the wound, stopped at being a threat. She was already moving again. Through the door, into the parking lot, boots pounding asphalt, eyes scanning. The black SUV roared to life, headlights blazing. The first shooter was scrambling inside, clutching something against his body. Tires screamed against pavement as the vehicle fishtailed toward the interstate with an acceleration that suggested a modified engine and a planned extraction route. Professional, rehearsed, gone before Jolene could close the distance. She let them go, because 20 feet away, a boy was lying on the asphalt, Small, so impossibly small, couldn't be more than 11 or 12, wearing a hoodie so thin she could see through it in places. Sneakers with the soles peeling away from the uppers. The kind of child who existed in the margins of society's peripheral vision, seen and unseen simultaneously present, but never quite real enough to demand the world's attention. He was staring up at the sky, eyes wide, each breath coming shallow and sharp, like his lungs were fighting against something his body couldn't explain. His left side was dark with a spreading wetness that looked black under the sodium lights, but Jolene knew was red. She'd seen enough blood in her life to recognize it by the way it moved, by the way it caught light, by the way it smelled when there was enough of it pooling on warm asphalt. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands going automatically to the wound, fingers pressing hard into his side, trying to slow the river, trying to keep his life from draining onto truck stop concrete in the middle of nowhere. His blood was hot against her palms, slick and real and terrifying in a way that her own injuries had never frightened her, because this was a child's blood, and children were not supposed to bleed like this, were not supposed to lie on parking lots at 3 in the morning with bullet holes in their bodies and eyes that were working very hard to stay focused on a world that was trying to go dark. "Stay with me, kid." Her voice came out harder than she intended. Command voice. The voice that had talked down violent drunks and maintained order in clubhouses, and once convinced a state trooper that the suspicious shape under her jacket was absolutely nothing worth investigating. "Hey, look at me. What's your name?" His eyes rolled toward her, struggled to find purchase. Lips moved. Sound came out thin and reedy, the voice of someone speaking from very far away. "Kip." She filed it, made it real. He had a name, was a person, not just a random kid who'd done something impossibly stupid and impossibly brave on a patch of asphalt that nobody would remember tomorrow. "I'm Jolene. You just stepped in front of a bullet for me, Kip. Why?" The question probably wasn't fair. You didn't ask a boy who was bleeding out to justify his choices. But she needed to understand what would make a child do what this child had done. What kind of desperation or courage or damaged wiring produced an 11-year-old who threw himself between a stranger and a gun? His answer came in fragments, words separated by gasps that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deeper than his lungs. "Because nobody stepped in front of one for my mom." Pause, breath like broken glass. "Because Norah begged me to do something, and I just stood there." Another breath, weaker. "Because I couldn't live with that silence one more day." Each word landed on Jolene with the force of something heavier than language. She saw it all in the spaces between his sentences. The guilt, the trauma, the bone-deep, marrow-deep need to redeem himself for some failure that probably wasn't his fault, but felt like a verdict he'd been living under for years. She saw herself reflected back in miniature. Different details, different decades. Same desperate arithmetic of trying to protect the people who mattered when the world kept insisting you weren't enough. "Someone should have stopped it," he managed. "For my family." Nobody did. Sirens in the distance, getting closer, red and blue lights painting the desert horizon in colors that meant help was coming, but might arrive too late. Jolene's jaw clenched. Rage built behind her eyes, but none of it pointed at this boy. All of it aimed at whatever series of failures, institutional and personal and systemic, had produced an 11-year-old who slept behind dumpsters and valued his own life so little that throwing it away for a stranger felt like an improvement. She leaned closer, close enough that he could smell leather and engine oil and the copper scent of his own blood on her hands. Close enough that her words carried weight even through his fading focus. "You listen to me, Kip." Her voice dropped, fierce and low and loaded with a conviction that came from somewhere she couldn't name. "You didn't just save some random biker. You saved a grandmother. If I died out here tonight, my granddaughter goes back to a father who can't take care of himself, let alone a 7-year-old. You didn't just save me, you saved her future." His eyes were losing focus, skin going pale beneath the grime and the sodium light. Breathing getting shallower, each exhale carrying less substance than the one before. But he was still holding, still fighting, still refusing to let go of a life that hadn't given him many reasons to hold on. "Did I at least do something right this time?" The question came out small, childlike. The voice of a kid who'd spent too long measuring himself against a failure he couldn't undo and finding the measurements short every single time. Jolene's grip tightened on his hand. Her other palm kept pressure on the wound, feeling his pulse beat against her fingers. She needed him to hear this, needed it to be the last thing he processed if the next few minutes went the wrong direction. You did more than right. You did what grown men wouldn't. And in my world, that means something. The paramedics arrived running, stretcher rattling, medical jargon flying fast enough that Jolene only caught fragments. Blood pressure dropping, pulse thready, gunshot wound lower left abdomen. Possible organ involvement. Need trauma team on standby. Someone tried to move her aside. She snarled, not a word. An actual sound, guttural and territorial, the noise of something protecting its own. I've got the bleed. You get the line in. They listened, maybe because her hands were already doing the work and switching positions in a crisis was dangerous. Maybe because the authority in her voice left no space for negotiation. Maybe because something in her face communicated clearly that arguing with this woman would cost more time than it saved. They loaded Kip as gently as the physics of the situation allowed, but physics didn't care about gentleness. Pain detonated through his small body as the stretcher lifted. She watched him bite down on the scream, swallow it, take it inside rather than let it escape. An 11-year-old boy who'd learned that showing pain invited more of it, that keeping silent was safer than crying out. That was wrong. All of it was wrong. 11-year-old boys should scream when they hurt. Should have adults who made the pain stop instead of adults who caused it. The ambulance doors open. Jolene climbed in without asking permission. Ma'am, you can't. The paramedics started. He saved my life. Her voice was steel-cooled in ice water. That makes him mine. I'm not leaving. The paramedic looked at her, at the vest with its patches and implications, at her hands painted with a child's blood, made a rapid calculation about which battle was worth fighting and which would only waste time that the boy on the gurney didn't have. Fine, but stay out of the way. Jolene wedged herself into the corner. Watch them work. I have line punching into a vein so collapsed from dehydration that it took 3 attempts. Oxygen mask fogging with breaths too shallow to sustain consciousness. Pressure bandages turning red almost as fast as they could be applied. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Blood smeared across the screen. She didn't care. Scrolled through contacts until she found the name she needed. Cormac Hale, 62 years old, president of the New Mexico chapter. The man who'd given Jolene her patch 15 years ago when she'd shown up at the clubhouse 6 months after burying Ray, hollowed out by grief and carrying the accumulated damage of a life that had already broken her more than once. Her first marriage years before Ray had taught her what fists felt like against her own skin. Ray Beckett had taught her what love looked like. Losing him to cancer had taught her that she needed a family forged from something harder than blood, a family that understood what it meant to fight back. The line rang once, twice. A rough voice answered, heavy with interrupted sleep, and the particular irritation of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that calls at this hour never brought good news. This better be worth waking me up. I need the club. Jolene's voice was steady now, combat calm. The voice of someone who'd made a decision and had no interest in being talked out of it. I'm calling in the oath. Silence, long enough that Jolene could hear Cormac's breathing change. Sleep evaporating, attention sharpening. You sure about that? That's not something we invoke lightly. She looked at Kip, pale as paper on the gurney. Machines doing the breathing his body couldn't manage alone. Blood on everything. A child the world had thrown away who'd proven he had more courage than men 3 times his size. I'm sure a kid named Kip just took a bullet for me. Someone tried to kill me, Cormac. Professional hit. 2 shooters, black SUV. They knew where I'd be and when. Harlon. Cormac didn't make it a Christian. Has to be. Jolene's free hand curled into a fist. He gets me out of the picture. He gets Darcy. Gets the inheritance. Gets everything. Where are you, ambulance, heading? To Albuquerque Medical Center. The boy's critical. I'll make calls. Cormac's voice carried the weight of promises that would be kept because they were the kind of promises that defined who you were if you kept them and destroyed who you were if you didn't. By morning, he doesn't wake up alone. None of this stays quiet. You understand what you're starting. Once the oath goes out, the whole brotherhood knows. Jolene understood perfectly. The oath wasn't casual. It was an invocation, a declaration that someone outside the club had done something so significant that their life was now woven into the fabric of the brotherhood itself, that anyone who came for them came for all of them. It meant Kip would never be invisible again, for better or worse, whether he wanted it or not. I understand. Do it. She hung up, looked at the paramedic adjusting Kip's IV drip. Is he gonna make it? The young man didn't meet her eyes. Bad sign. Bullet went through clean. Missed the major organs, but he's lost a lot of blood, and I don't know how long he was on the street before tonight. Malnutrition, dehydration, possible infection. His body was already compromised before this happened. Adding this kind of trauma on top of that, he let the implication hang in the recycled air of the ambulance, like something heavy waiting to fall. He's a fighter, Jolene said. Stated it like she was reading the result off a lab test. He'll make it. The ambulance screamed through the desert night, lights painting the darkness red and blue, sirens scattering the silence of empty highway. Inside, machines beeped and hissed, performing the mechanical work of keeping a boy alive who decided that dying with purpose was better than living without it. Jolene kept her hand on his, anchoring him, letting him know, even unconscious, that the days of nobody noticing were over. The note was still in her pocket. She'd grabbed it from the asphalt in the chaos, scooped it up without thinking, the way you grab evidence before it disappears. Blood-smeared paper with handwriting so neat it looked printed. 5 words in blue ink. Eliminate mother. Son inherits estate plus custody of child. Harlon, her own son. The baby she'd rocked to sleep in a house on Thornton Street while his father worked doubles at the refinery. The toddler who'd put his fat hands on her cheeks and said mama like it was the most important word in any language. The teenager she'd watched darken year by year as the drugs hollowed him out and replaced everything she'd loved with something hungry and calculating and incapable of seeing other people as anything other than obstacles or resources. He'd tried to kill her for money. For a granddaughter he didn't love but wanted, because Darcy's trust fund that Jolene had built from Ray's life insurance after the cancer took him was worth enough to make murder seem like a reasonable investment. The rage that moved through her was nothing like fire. Fire was visible, dramatic, destructive, in ways that announced themselves. This was colder, deeper, the kind of anger that didn't explode or shatter or leave evidence. The kind that planned, that strategized, that would systematically dismantle whatever Harlon thought he'd built and make sure he never threatened Darcy again. But first, this boy had to live. First, the oath had to be honored. First, she had to prove that when someone stepped in for you, you stepped in for them. No matter the cause, no matter how complicated, it made everything that came next. The hospital materialized out of the darkness. White buildings against black sky. Emergency entrance blazing with fluorescent light. They wheeled Kip in at a run. Jolene followed until a nurse blocked her path with the professional firmness of someone accustomed to preventing unauthorized humans from entering restricted spaces. Family only beyond this point. I'm all he's got. The statement hovered between lie and truth. Might be completely accurate for all she knew about this boy's circumstances. The nurse assessed her. The vest, the blood, the set of Jolene's jaw that communicated without ambiguity that removing her from this hallway would require more personnel and more conflict than the situation warranted. Waiting room is through there. We'll update you when we can. Jolene took it. Not permission exactly, but not refusal. A crack in the wall wide enough to exist inside. The waiting room was the particular purgatory that hospitals had perfected over decades of practice. Chairs designed to prevent comfort. Lighting calibrated to drain the color from human skin. A television mounted in the corner playing news with the sound off, closed captions scrolling catastrophes that seemed trivial compared to what was happening behind the double doors. Coffee from a machine that produced a liquid technically related to coffee, the way a photocopy was technically related to an original. Jolene couldn't sit. Energy needed somewhere to go, and stillness felt like surrender. She paced, wall to window to wall, counting steps because counting was something to do that wasn't thinking about an 11-year-old on an operating table with a bullet wound and a body that had already been fighting for survival long before tonight. Her phone buzzed. Text from Cormac. Word is out. Brothers are rolling. How many do you need? She stared at the question. realized she hadn't planned beyond the invocation itself. Hadn't considered the logistics of what came after calling in a sacred obligation that activated an entire network of people bound by oaths older than most of them. All of them, she typed back. He earned all of them. You'll have it. Sunrise full chapter. Anyone close enough to ride rides. Jolene's throat tightened. The Brotherhood was imperfect, often brutal, frequently judged by people who saw the leather and the patches and made assumptions about character based on appearance. But when it mattered, when one of their own called in the voice that said, "This is real and this is now, and I need you," they came. No questions, no hesitation, no calculation about whether the drive was too long or the hour too early or the situation too complicated. They just came. And now Kip was one of them, whether he knew it yet or not. Hours passed. Doctors emerged and retreated through the double doors like messengers from a world governed by different rules. They spoke in terminology that Jolene caught in fragments. Surgery successful, 2 units of blood, stable but critical, severely malnourished, immune system compromised. The next 48 hours will tell us what we need to know. Touch and go. The phrase that meant humanity had done everything within its power, and now the outcome depended on forces that medicine couldn't measure or control. She finally sat, not because the energy had burned off, but because her legs refused to carry her any further. She stared at her hands. Kip's blood had dried brown beneath her fingernails, settled into the creases of her knuckles, stained the calluses that decades of riding had built. She should wash it off, should find a restroom and scrub until her skin was raw, and her hands looked like they belonged to a woman who hadn't spent the night holding a child's life between her palms. She didn't move. Dawn came slowly, light seeping through the waiting room windows with the caution of something that wasn't sure it wanted to illuminate what it would find. Jolene watched the sun rise over Albuquerque and thought about Darcy 340 miles away, waking up in a bed Jolene had made in a room Jolene had painted, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a grandmother's love, completely unaware that everything was about to change. The parking lot outside had begun to fill, but not with cars, motorcycles. Arriving in pairs at first, then clusters, then a steady stream that showed no sign of stopping. Harley's choppers, custom builds with chrome that caught the early light and threw it back in blinding flashes. They parked in rows with a precision that suggested military experience or decades of practice or both. Neat lines of steel and leather stretching across the hospital lot. Jolene walked to the window, watched them gather, counted without meaning to, 20, 40, 60. The numbers kept climbing. Men and women swinging off bikes, stretching road-stiff muscles, some looking like they'd been riding for hours, some still wearing the rumpled evidence of having been pulled from bed at 4 a.m. by a phone call that said, "Someone needs us." All wearing vests with patches from different chapters, different states, different histories connected by the same code. A nurse appeared at Jolene's elbow, stared out the window with an expression that blended concern with something closer to awe. "Ma'am, what is happening in our parking lot?" "A sacred obligation," Jolene said. Like that explained everything. And for anyone who spoke the language it did, Cormac walked through the emergency entrance at 7:15. 62 years old with more scars and smooth skin and eyes that had cataloged the worst of humanity and occasionally its best. He spotted Jolene immediately. Crossed the waiting room in 3 long strides. "How many?" she asked. "Last count 927, still climbing. Got brothers riding in from Arizona, Colorado, Texas. Word moves fast when the oath gets called. 927 people. For a boy they'd never met. Because one of their own said he mattered." Jolene's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "He's in surgery. Touch and go." Cormac's jaw tightened. "He's got 900 reasons to pull through. Kids that brave don't give up easy." A doctor emerged through the double doors, young, exhausted, wearing scrubs that still carried evidence of Kip's blood in rusty patches across the chest. He looked around the waiting room. Family of Kip Renner. Jolene stepped forward. "Here." The doctor's eyes went to her vest. Processed. Decided not to comment. "He's out of surgery. Bullet went through clean. We've repaired the damage and given him 2 units of blood. He's stable." Jolene heard the word he hadn't said yet. "But he's severely malnourished, dehydrated." His immune system is compromised. We're keeping him sedated to let his body focus on healing. The next 48 hours are critical. If infection sets in, he didn't finish, didn't need to. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated, glanced toward the window at the parking lot now overflowing with motorcycles visible through the glass. I think we can make an exception. 5 minutes. She followed him through corridors that all looked the same into the ICU where machines performed the tireless work of keeping damaged bodies functioning. Kip looked like he barely displaced the mattress beneath him, swallowed by equipment in white sheets, surrounded by equipment that dwarfed him. IV lines, oxygen mask monitors displaying numbers that Jolene didn't fully understand but watched anyway, because watching was something she could do when everything else was out of her hands. His skin was pale against white sheets, his breathing assisted by machines that made soft rhythmic sounds. But he was alive. Against odds that had been stacked against him since long before tonight, he was still here, still fighting. She pulled a chair close, took his hand carefully avoiding the IV line. His fingers were thin, cold despite the warm blankets. The hand of a child who'd been hungry for months and alone for years and still found the strength to run toward a gun instead of away from it. You're going to make it, she told him. Stated it like a command, like her will alone could bend the mechanics of biology and infection and malnutrition into compliance. You're going to wake up and see something you've probably never seen before. People who give a damn, who stepped in for you the way you stepped in for me. His fingers twitched. Maybe reflex, maybe something deeper. I don't know your whole story yet, she continued. Don't know what put you on the street or who failed you or what you've been surviving to get here. But I know this, you saved my granddaughter's future tonight. That's a debt I spend the rest of my life repaying. Starting now, her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, then looked. The message hit her like a second bullet. This is Ellery Marsh from New Mexico Child Protective Services. I've been assigned to Darcy Beckett's case. I need to speak with you immediately regarding an emergency custody motion filed by Harlon Beckett this morning. Jolene's hand tightened around Kip's. Her other hand was already dialing. Ellery answered on the first ring. Professional voice with the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver bad news without inflection. Ms. Beckett, thank you for calling back. I need to inform you that your son, Harlon Beckett, filed an emergency petition this morning claiming that you were involved in a gang-related shooting incident last night. He's arguing that Darcy is in immediate danger due to your lifestyle and associations. A judge has granted a temporary order. Darcy has been placed in 72-hour emergency foster care pending a full hearing. Each sentence landed with precision. Surgical, devastating. He tried to have me killed. Jolene's voice was flat, shock doing the work that self-control couldn't. Last night, 2 hired guns professional hit. The only reason I'm alive is because a homeless boy saw them coming and took a bullet that was meant for me. That's a serious allegation, Ms. Beckett. I have a note from the shooter's pocket. Eliminate mother. Son inherits estate plus custody of child. That's not an allegation, that's evidence. I need to see that note. And I need a formal statement. Can you come to my office? I'm at the hospital. With the boy who saved my life. He's 11 years old and he almost died because my son decided I was worth more dead than alive. Pause. Jolene could hear Ellery recalibrating, recalculating, reassessing a case that had just become exponentially more complicated than the paperwork suggested. I'll come to you, Ellery said. Albuquerque Medical Center. Yes, give me an hour. And Ms. Beckett, don't leave. Don't contact Harlon. Don't do anything that could be characterized as aggressive or threatening. The next 72 hours are critical for both situations, yours and the child's. The line went dead. Jolene sat in the ICU's mechanical silence holding the hand of a boy who'd saved her thinking about a granddaughter 340 miles away, who was waking up in a stranger's house right now. Wondering if anyone had explained what was happening in words that didn't sound like abandonment. Wondering if Darcy understood, or if she was just sitting somewhere unfamiliar with unfamiliar blankets and unfamiliar sounds waiting for a grandmother who'd promised to always come back and now seemed to have disappeared. Her phone rang again. Cormac, we've got a problem, he said without preamble. Another one. News crews. Someone tipped them about 900 bikers gathering at a hospital. They're already running stories about gang activity. This is going to hurt you in court. Jolene closed her eyes, thought through the exhaustion and the fear, and the cold rage that hadn't dimmed since she'd read the note in the ambulance. Tell everyone to stand down. Pull out. Last thing I need is footage of the Hells Angels looking like an occupying force outside a children's hospital. You sure they came for the kid? For you. I know, and I'm grateful. But right now, the best thing the Brotherhood can do for me is not give Harlan's lawyer more ammunition. We regroup, we plan, and we do this smart. Cormac was quiet for a moment. Right? We'll roll out. But Jolene, the oath doesn't expire because it's inconvenient. That boy's under our protection. So are you. Harlon comes at either of you again, he goes through all of us. She hung up. Looked at Kip, still unconscious, still fighting, still alive, because something inside him had decided that dying while running toward danger was better than living while standing still. Then she looked at the phone in her hand, at the message from Ellery Marsh that had turned a crisis into a catastrophe, at the blank screen where Harlan's name would appear if she called him, if she screamed at her own son for trying to kill her, for using their shared blood as a weapon, for seeing Darcy as nothing more than a number in a trust fund ledger. She didn't call, didn't scream, didn't break. Instead, she opened a new message, typed a text to Cormac. 3 sentences. Get me everything on Harlan's finances. Every contact, every meeting, every dollar he's spent in the last 6 months. And find out who Emmett Slayton is, the man he hired to kill me. I want to know everything about him by tonight. She hit send, put the phone away, looked at Kip one more time. Rest, she told him. Heal. When you wake up, I'll be here. And we're going to show them what happens when they underestimate a grandmother with nothing left to lose except the people she loves. Then she sat back in the chair, kept her hand on his, and began to plan. Not with the desperate improvisation of someone reacting to crisis, with the cold, methodical precision of a woman who'd survived every version of destruction the world had aimed at her and was now done playing defense. 72 hours. 3 days to save a granddaughter from a system that had already failed her, to keep alive a boy the world had discarded, to gather enough evidence to bury a son she'd raised and lost, and now had to destroy before he destroyed everything she'd built. 3 days. And Jolene Beckett had never needed more than that to change the terms of a fight. Outside the hospital window, the motorcycles were beginning to clear out. 927 engines rumbling to life in a controlled exodus that still managed to make the building's windows vibrate in their frames. A promise withdrawing but not disappearing. Relocating, not retreating. And somewhere on the other side of those mountains, a 7-year-old girl named Darcy was sitting in a stranger's kitchen eating cereal that tasted wrong, looking at a door that her grandmother hadn't walked through yet, holding on to a belief that was getting harder to hold with every hour that passed. Hold on, baby, Jolene thought. Grandma's coming, and when I get there, nobody takes you from me again. Kip woke to pain, and then to confusion, and then to the slow, terrible realization that he was still alive in a world he'd been fairly certain was finished with him. White ceiling, not the sky, not the stained underside of a highway overpass or the rusted metal of a dumpster lid. An actual ceiling, smooth and clean, and institutional, lit by fluorescent panels that hummed with the steady, indifferent persistence of machines performing tasks they'd perform whether anyone was watching or not. Beeping from somewhere to his right. Rhythmic, mechanical, each tone spaced with a precision that human hearts rarely achieved on their own. The chemical smell of antiseptic layered over something warmer. Something organic, the smell of a body that had been opened and repaired and was now being monitored by equipment that cost more than everything Kip had ever owned combined. He tried to sit up. His body responded with a protest so immediate and so absolute that he stopped moving before the intention fully formed. Pain radiated from his left side in concentric waves, each one slightly different in character. The deep grinding ache of damaged tissue, the sharper bite of stitches pulling against skin that didn't want to be held together by thread. The general full-body exhaustion of a system that had been running on empty for months and had now been asked to heal a bullet wound on top of everything else it was already failing to manage. Easy. The voice came from his left, familiar in a way that didn't make sense because Kip had known this woman for less than an hour before consciousness abandoned him. You've got stitches and staples holding your insides where they belong. Sudden movements are a terrible idea. He turned his head slowly. Jolene Beckett was sitting in a chair beside his bed. Same leather vest, Same dark hair with its threads of gray pulled back tight. Same face, though the exhaustion had deepened in the hours or days since he'd last seen it, settling into the lines around her eyes and mouth like water finding the lowest ground. She looked like she'd been sitting in that chair since they'd wheeled him in. Like leaving hadn't occurred to her, or if it had, she'd dismissed the thought with the same efficiency she'd used to dismiss the second shooter's attempt on her life. How long his voice came out as wreckage, throat raw from a tube he didn't remember, and vocal cords that felt like they'd been sandpapered. 36 hours since surgery. You've been drifting, mostly under. Fragments surfaced through the fog. The gun, the running, the white-hot detonation in his side, and the asphalt rushing up to meet him. Jolene's hands pressing into his body, warm and certain, and refusing to let go. The ambulance, its siren, a distant wail that seemed to belong to someone else's emergency. After that, nothing. Fever dreams and darkness, and the occasional sensation of a hand holding, his anchoring him to a world he kept trying to float away from. You had 927 people show up to make sure you didn't wake up alone, Jolene said, letting the number settle between them like something with physical weight. Kip blinked, tried to process the figure. Failed. Why? Because I called in something called the sacred oath. Because you saved my life, and in my world, that means something permanent. She leaned forward in the chair, elbows on her knees, eyes locked on his with the intensity of someone about to ask for something they had no right to ask and knew it. But we've got problems, Kip. Both of us. And I need your help. He should have said no. Should have thanked her for whatever medical care had kept him breathing and started planning his disappearance back into the margins where he belonged. Getting tangled in a biker grandmother's custody war wasn't smart, wasn't safe, wasn't his responsibility. 3 years of surviving alone had taught him that other people's problems were gravity wells, and if you got too close, they'd pull you in and crush you. But Norah's face was there, the way it always was, floating behind his conscious thoughts, like a photograph held up to light. And the memory of standing frozen while the world hurt the people he was supposed to protect. And the feeling still vivid despite the pain medication and the fog of finally moving when it mattered. Of discovering that his legs worked when his heart demanded it, even when his brain screamed otherwise. What kind of problems? Jolene told him everything. Harlon hiring the hit, the note from the shooter's pocket, Darcy pulled from her home and placed in emergency foster care because a judge saw photographs of 900 bikers and decided that a grandmother in a leather vest was more dangerous than a father with a meth habit and a murder contract. The 72-hour window that had already burned through half its time. Emmett Slayton, the man who'd been paid to kill her and who was now somewhere in the city recalculating his options. The custody hearing that would determine whether a 7-year-old girl grew up with love or with a man who saw her as a line item on a financial statement. When she finished, the ICU's mechanical sounds filled the silence. Monitors beeping, oxygen hissing, the soft rhythmic percussion of machines keeping a boy alive, while the world outside arranged itself into configurations that would determine whether his survival meant anything beyond survival itself. Kip was quiet for a long time, processing, turning the information over the way he'd learned to turn over problems on the street, examining them from angles that most people didn't think to check, looking for the edges where solutions hid. You need evidence, he said. Audio, video, something a judge can't ignore. Your word against Harlan's lawyer isn't enough. Not with those photos of the bikers already in the file. That's where you come in. Jolene's eyes didn't waver. You spent 3 months moving through the world like you weren't there. I need those skills. Someone who can get close to Harlan without registering on his radar. Someone who can document what he's doing and who he's meeting and what he says when he thinks nobody's listening. You want me to follow him. I want you to help me save Darcy, and in the process, I'm going to help you save yourself. She pulled out her phone, showed him the lock screen. The same photograph he glimpsed from across a parking lot a lifetime ago. Little girl with auburn hair that defied physics, gap-toothed grin, Hell's Angel shirt worn as a dress, standing in front of a Harley with the confidence of someone who'd never been taught to be afraid of the world. This is my granddaughter. She's 7 years old. Right now, she's in a stranger's house, eating food that tastes wrong, sleeping in a bed that doesn't smell like home. Every hour that passes, she loses a little more faith that the adults in her life are going to keep their promises. I cannot let that continue, but I can't do this alone. Kip looked at the photograph, saw Norah superimposed over Darcy's features. Different face, different hair, different circumstances. Same age, same innocence that the world was methodically working to extinguish. Same need for someone to stand between them and the people who should have been protecting them but had become the threat instead. "If I help you," he said, the words forming slowly, each one tested for weight before he let it go. "You help me find my sister." "Yes, she's been in foster care for 3 years. 6 different placements. I don't know where she is, or if she's safe, or if she even remembers me." "We'll find her. My tech specialist is already looking." "But Kip, I need you to understand something." Jolene's voice dropped, quiet enough that the monitors nearly drowned it. "If you do this, and Harlon figures out you're not just some random street kid, if Emmett Slayton realizes you're part of what's happening, they will come for you. And if they do, then they go through me first, and through 900 people behind me. That's what the oath means. You're under protection now. Full weight of the Brotherhood. Anyone touches you, they answer to all of us." It should have sounded like an empty promise, the kind that adults scattered like confetti, bright and meaningless, dissolving the moment real pressure was applied. Kip had collected enough broken promises to know their shape, their weight, the hollow sound they made when you held them up to your ear and listened for substance. But Jolene said it like a contract signed in something that didn't wash off, like she understood that breaking it would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. "Okay," Kip said. "Tell me what you need." Well, Reese Whitlow arrived at the hospital that afternoon. Mid-40s, red hair shot through with metallic silver tattoos crawling up both forearms in patterns that suggested either military service or a very specific kind of professional experience. She walked into the ICU with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent time in environments where hesitation was the difference between breathing and not breathing. Leather vest marked with Arizona chapter patches, eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. Jolene made introductions. Reese pulled up a chair, studied Kip with the clinical attention of someone assessing an asset's capabilities. "Heard you took a bullet for Diesel." That true Diesel was Jolene's road name. Ernest Reese explained, by riding 400 miles through a sandstorm to reach her husband before the cancer killed him. Made it with 20 minutes to spare. Road names meant something in this world. They were earned through actions that the Brotherhood decided were worth remembering. Kip nodded. Reese nodded back. No sentiment, no excess, just the acknowledgement of one person's assessment of another person's courage filed away and weighted accordingly. Quinn laid a laptop on the bedside table. Open files. Satellite images, financial records, phone logs, movement patterns. All of it compiled in the 36 hours since Jolene had made the call. "Here's what we know about Harlon Beckett," Reese said. "Creature of habit. Meets his dealer every Tuesday and Friday at a bar called the Dusty Rose on the South Side. Meets with his lawyer Wednesday mornings at a coffee shop in Nob Hill. Spends Thursday nights at his girlfriend's apartment in the South Valley. Pays for everything in cash, except when he forgets, which is often because meth and financial discipline don't coexist." "How do you know all this?" Kip asked. "Because I've been watching him since Jolene called the oath. Due diligence. You don't engage a target you haven't studied." Reese pulled up another file. Photograph of a man Kip had never seen. Average height, average build. Face designed by nature to be forgotten 5 seconds after you saw it. Except for the eyes. Even in a surveillance photograph taken from distance, the eyes were wrong. Flat, professional. The eyes of someone who'd learned to disconnect from the parts of himself that might object to what the rest of him did for a living. Emmett Slayton, 45. Former military, dishonorably discharged. Private security for 6 years, then freelance work that the records describe as consulting, but that everyone in the intelligence community recognizes as contract killing. 3 suspected hits in the last decade. No convictions. No arrests. The kind of professional who doesn't make mistakes. "He made one last night," Jolene said. "He missed. He missed because an 11-year-old kid did something nobody planned for." Reese's expression suggested that she didn't consider this a reliable tactical advantage. "Next time he won't have an audience screaming warnings." Jolene leaned forward. "Can we prove the connection between Harlon and Slayton?" "Not yet. Harlan's been careful about one thing. He pays through a shell company registered to his girlfriend's name. Money flows through 2 intermediary accounts before it reaches Slayton. On paper, there's no direct link. Then we create one. Jolene's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already worked through the problem and arrived at a solution she didn't particularly like, but was prepared to execute. We need Harlon on recording, talking to Slayton, discussing the hit, discussing Darcy, discussing money. Audio that a DA can take to a grand jury and a judge can't dismiss. That's where your boy comes in. Reese looked at Kip. You follow Harlon, document his meetings, record his conversations. Get close enough to capture evidence, but not so close that he notices you exist. Kip thought about 3 months of sleeping behind dumpsters, about learning to move through crowded spaces like water through a sieve, about the particular skill of being present without registering on anyone's consciousness, of occupying the dead spots in people's peripheral vision where attention didn't reach. I can do that. Good, because we've got less than 36 hours before the custody hearing. We need evidence before that judge takes the bench, or Darcy ends up a permanent ward of a system that's already failed her once. Jolene stood, pulled Reese aside. Kip watched them talk in low voices, saw Jolene's hands moving with the precision of someone drawing battle plans in the air. Not asking for input, giving instructions. Reese listened, nodded, asked one question that Kip couldn't hear, received an answer that seemed to satisfy her. When Jolene came back, her expression had the settled quality of a decision that had been made and wouldn't be revisited. Here's how this works, she said. Reese wires you with equipment so small looks like shirt buttons. Audio recorder, GPS tracker sewn into your jacket lining. Panic button disguised as a charity bracelet. You follow Harlon to the Dusty Rose tonight. I'll be 3 parking spots away on my bike, close enough to reach you in under 60 seconds if anything goes wrong. You record everything you can. We get what we need and we get out. And if Harlon makes me, he won't. Jolene's voice carried a certainty that felt less like reassurance and more like a statement of operational parameters. You've been invisible for 3 years. He's a 35-year-old meth addict whose attention span barely covers the distance between his hand and his pipe. You're a ghost. He's not equipped to see ghosts. Cormac arrived to handle logistics, positioning backup riders at intervals around the bar, establishing communication protocols, setting up extraction routes, all of it organized around Jolene's plan and all of it flowing from her decisions. Cormac offered suggestions, Reese raised operational concerns, but the architecture was Jolene's, and everyone in the room understood that the chain of command started and ended with the woman in the leather vest who was fighting for a granddaughter and had acquired a wounded boy along the way. The Dusty Rose sat on a block of South Albuquerque where the buildings looked like they'd been constructed from cigarette smoke and bad decisions. One story, flat roof, neon sign with 2 burned-out letters that turned the name into something illegible. Parking lot full of vehicles that had seen better decades. The kind of establishment where the bartender didn't remember faces because remembering faces was bad for business. Kip entered alone, walked through the front door with the shuffling gait of a kid looking for a bathroom or a vending machine. Hands in his pockets, eyes down, radiating the particular harmlessness of someone too young and too small to be worth noticing. He found a booth 2 rows from the back corner, slid in, pulled out the cracked phone that had no service but looked functional enough to serve as a prop. A kid killing time. Background noise. Furniture. Harlon Beckett was already there. Back corner booth. 35 years old but wearing the face of a man 20 years older. Meth had done its architectural work with the thoroughness of a demolition crew. Hollowing out the cheeks, sinking the eyes, stretching the skin over bone, until the skull's geometry was visible beneath. Twitchy movements, fingers that couldn't stay still, the restless, brittle energy of a body running on chemicals that demanded constant replenishment. He was meeting his dealer. Transaction first, envelope passed across the table, small package received in return. Disappeared into Harlon's jacket with the practiced speed of a man who'd performed this exchange hundreds of times. Kip watched without watching. The art of peripheral observation. Eyes on his dead phone, ears tuned to frequencies that most people's attention didn't reach. The wire hidden in his collar capturing audio so with a sensitivity that Reese had described as capable of picking up heartbeats from across a room. The dealer left. Harlon stayed, ordered another drink, checked his phone with the nervous repetition of someone waiting for news that would determine whether his night got better or significantly worse. And then Emmett Slayton walked in. Kip recognized him from the surveillance photograph. The forgettable face, the average build. But in person, the wrongness that the photograph had only hinted at was fully visible. Emmett moved through the bar the way certain predators move through environments that contain prey, with a relaxed efficiency that communicated absolute confidence in his position at the top of whatever food chain applied. His eyes scanned the room once, registered everything, dismissed most of it, slid past Kip without pausing the way one knew. Eyes slid past furniture and light fixtures and all the other background elements that a brain processed without engaging. Invisible. Still invisible. The skill that had kept Kip alive was now keeping someone else alive. Emmett sat across from Harlon. No greeting, no small talk. The conversation began mid-thought as if they'd been talking continuously, and this was merely a resumption after a brief intermission. Harlon spoke first, voice carrying the petulant whine of a man who'd never learned to manage frustration because the drugs did that work for him. The old woman survived. You told me it was handled. The boy complicated things. Emmett's voice was flat, stripped of inflection the way a room could be stripped of furniture, leaving only the bare structure. The job isn't finished. Chilled, how much more? Another 20,000. Half now, half when it's confirmed. I don't have that kind of cash. Then find it. Or explain to the people you owe why you can't pay what they're expecting. Your choice, Harlon. I don't much care which way you go. Silence. The ambient noise of the bar filling the space where Harlon's options should have been. Glasses clinking, pool balls cracking, a jukebox playing something country and mournful in the far corner. Then Harlon spoke again, lower, leaning forward. What about the kid, the one who took the bullet? What about him? He could be useful. Leverage. The old woman's protecting him now. Heard she called in some biker oath, got hundreds of people treating him like family. That means she cares about him. Means we can use him to make her do what we want. The words hit Kip's bloodstream like ice water. Not fear exactly, something colder than fear. The recognition that he had just become a variable in someone else's equation. That his survival, which had felt like a private triumph in the hospital bed, was now a tactical vulnerability that men with guns were discussing over cheap whiskey in a bar where nobody asked questions. Emmett considered this. His expression didn't change, but something behind the flat surface of his eyes recalculated. Risky. Kidnapping draws attention. Federal attention. That's a different level of heat than a clean hit in a parking lot. It could work, though, Harlon pressed. We grab the kid. Tell Jolene she's got 6 hours to drop the custody case. Tell the judge she's unfit, sign over everything. She does what we say, the kid goes back. She doesn't, you handle it. Define handle it. Whatever needs to happen, make it clean. Make it look like a runaway who ran into the wrong people. Nobody's looking for a homeless kid. Nobody's going to investigate. Emmett studied Harlon for a long moment, then nodded once. Give me 24 hours. I'll put something together. They left separately. Harlon first weaving through the parking lot with the unsteady gait of a man whose relationship with vertical surfaces was adversarial. Emmett 5 minutes later moving with the unhurried precision of someone who never had to worry about being followed because he'd spent a career making sure he was the one doing the following. Kip waited until both were gone, then triggered the panic button on his wrist. Jolene appeared in the parking lot in 90 seconds, bike engine still warm, eyes already assessing the situation before Kip had finished crossing the asphalt toward her. What happened? Kip played the recording. Watched her face change. Not dramatically. Jolene Beckett wasn't the kind of woman whose emotions announced themselves through grand gestures. But the temperature behind her eyes dropped by degrees as the audio played each sentence from Harlon's mouth, freezing something that had still been warm, still been maternal, still been connected to the son she'd raised. By the time the recording finished, whatever remained of Jolene's relationship with Harlon had calcified into something harder than anger and more functional than grief. She looked at Kip, at the boy her own son had just discussed disposing of like an inconvenient variable. Get on the bike, she said, voice level, deadly calm. The voice of someone who'd passed through the territory of emotion and arrived at the landscape of operational planning that lay on the other side. We're going to Cormac's. We plan tonight. We execute tomorrow. The clubhouse occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial fringe of Albuquerque. Chain link and razor wire surrounding a building that looked abandoned from the outside and anything but from within. Pool table, bar, couches that had survived more conflicts than some nations. And Jolene standing at the center of it with the recording playing through speakers loud enough for every person in the room to hear Harlon's voice discussing the kidnapping and murder of an 11-year-old boy. When the audio finished, the silence had a physical quality, dense enough to feel against your skin. 15 bikers, men and women, different ages, different chapters, all wearing the same expression. The expression of people who'd heard something that demanded a response and were waiting to be told what form that response would take. Cormac spoke first. That simplifies things. They come for the kid. We've got justification to end this permanently. No. Jolene's voice cut through the murmur of agreement that had begun to build. We do this smart. We do it legal. We use this recording as evidence. We give it to the police, to the DA. We let the system handle it. The system. An older biker with a scar bisecting his left cheek from hairline to jaw spoke up. The system that put a 7-year-old with a junkie father in the first place. That let a meth head file emergency custody petitions. That looked at 900 people honoring an oath and saw a threat instead of a family. That system, Jolene said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that left no room for debate, is watching us right now, looking for exactly the excuse you want to give them. We go in with violence. We prove every stereotype they've constructed about us. We prove that Harlan's lawyer was right. We lose Darcy permanently. Not to Harlan, to the state. Is that what you want? The room was quiet. I want Harlan gone too, Jolene continued. Every bone in my body wants to ride to his girlfriend's apartment and show him what happens when you threaten children. But I love Darcy more than I hate Harlan. And that means I play this smart even when smart feels like surrender. Cormac nodded slowly. She's right. We go in hot. We confirm every headline they've ever written about us. We go in smart. We prove we're better than they think. So what's the play? Reese asked from her corner. Laptop open, ready to translate strategy into logistics. Jolene walked to the center of the room, drew the plan in the air with her hands the way a general drew on a map. We let them try to take Kip. We control the when, the where, and the how. Wire him, track him, set up a location that we've prepared in advance with surveillance equipment covering every angle. Let Emmett Slayton walk into a box he doesn't know is a box. Record everything. Get him on camera admitting to the hit, admitting to the kidnapping, connecting himself to Harlan. Package it for the DA with a ribbon on top. You're using the kid as bait. Cormac's tone was neutral. Observation, not objection. I'm giving him a choice. Jolene turned to Kip. She crossed the room, crouched so they were eye level. You don't have to do this. We can hide you. Keep you safe until the hearing. Find another way to get the evidence. But if you're willing, this ends it permanently. Kip thought about Norah, about 3 years of running, about the difference between being safe and being free, about a 7-year-old girl named Darcy who was sitting in a stranger's house right now because the system had decided that her grandmother's world was too dangerous, while her father, the man who'd ordered a killing, walked free. I'll do it, he said, but I want something in return. Name it. Find Norah. Get her out of whatever placement she's in. Give her the same protection you're giving me. Jolene didn't pause, didn't calculate. Done. Restart the search. I want Norah's current location and placement records by tonight. Reese was already typing. On it. They spent the next 6 hours building the trap. Reese fitted Kip with a wire so small it looked like a manufacturing defect in his shirt button. GPS tracker sewn into the lining of his jacket, the worn denim that had belonged to Reese's dead brother, and now carried a protection patch on its back. Panic button on his wrist disguised as a rubber charity bracelet, the kind that every teenager in America wore without anyone asking what it meant. Cormac positioned his people. Surveillance teams on rotating shifts around the motel Jolene had selected. A rundown place on Central Avenue where rooms rented by the hour and the management's commitment to guest privacy was absolute, because guest privacy was the only product they actually sold. Watchers on rooftops with sightlines to the entrance. Riders staged at 3 different intersections ready to mobilize in under 2 minutes. A net designed to let one person in and never let him out. But the critical piece was Jolene's addition. The detail that separated her plan from a standard operation. I'm in the room next door, she told Cormac. Not across the street, not in a van down the block. Next door, sharing a wall with whatever happens. That's not standard protocol. You're too close. If he finds you before he gets to the kid, then I handle it. The way I handled the second shooter at the truck stop. The way I've handled every threat that's come at my family for 30 years. Cormac studied her. Whatever he saw in her expression, he decided arguing was a losing proposition. All right, but the door between rooms stays unlocked and Reese monitors your feed separately. Anything goes wrong, we're through that wall in seconds. Agreed. Night fell. Jolene drove Kip to the motel, walked him to room 117, checked the surveillance equipment that Reese had installed during the afternoon. Cameras in the smoke detector, microphones in the lamp, audio pickup sensitive enough to capture a whisper from 10 feet. Birdie, the biker assigned to visible guard duty, positioned herself in the parking lot. 50s built solid with the weathered patience of someone who'd spent decades watching things that needed watching. She sat on her bike near the entrance, visible enough to be noticed, distracted enough to appear careless. If you see Slayton coming, you hit the button, Birdie told Kip. Don't try to fight, don't try to run. You're the bait, let us do the catching. Then they left him alone. Room 117 smelled like cigarette smoke and cleaning products that hadn't been effective since the previous decade. Stained carpet, thin curtains that filtered the parking lot's sodium light into a weak orange glow. A bed that sagged in the middle like it had given up on structural integrity years ago. Kip sat on the edge, wore the wire, kept the panic button within reach, listened to his own heartbeat, and waited for violence to find him one more time. Through the wall, he could hear Jolene, not her words, just the fact of her presence. Occasional movement, the creak of a chair, a sound that might have been her checking her phone. Close, real, present. Not a voice through a radio or a promise from a distance, but an actual human being, 12 inches of drywall away, betting her safety on the same plan she'd asked him to bet his on. It helped, knowing she was there. Knowing that for the first time in 3 years, the space between Kip and the nearest person who gave a damn about whether he lived or died could be measured in inches instead of miles. He didn't have to wait long. 2 in the morning, the door didn't explode, didn't splinter. The lock simply turned with a metallic click that was almost gentle, the sound of a tool operated by someone who'd opened locked doors so many times the mechanics had become instinctive. The door swung inward with the quiet confidence of a professional entering a space he'd already assessed and dismissed as non-threatening. Emmett Slayton stepped through, gun drawn, eyes scanning, processing the room in a single sweep that took less than 2 seconds and registered everything in it, including the boy on the bed and the panic button on the nightstand and the distance between the two. Nothing personal, kid. His voice was flat, the same absence of inflection that the surveillance photograph had promised. Wrong place, wrong time. You've got value to someone, and I've got debts that need paying. That's all this is. Kip's hand moved toward the nightstand, toward the bracelet. Emmett crossed the distance faster than a man of his build should have been able to move, hand closing around Kip's wrist with a grip that compressed bone against bone. The panic button fell to the carpet. Nice try. Emmett produced zip ties from his jacket, secured Kip's wrists behind his back, with movements that spoke of repetition of a skill practiced so often it required no conscious thought. Your biker friend in the parking lot is already handled. Sleeping. Not dead. I'm not wasteful. You're coming with me, and if you make noise, I'll make sure it's the last sound that comes out of your mouth. He pulled Kip to his feet, guided him through the door with one hand on the zip ties and the other holding the gun close to his body. Parking lot. Birdie was on the ground, unconscious, not dead as promised. Cable ties around her wrists and ankles. Professional restraint. A white van waited near the lot's exit. Engine running. Emmett opened the rear doors, placed Kip inside with a firmness that stopped short of violence. Slammed the doors shut, got behind the wheel. The vehicle pulled onto Central Avenue and drove east. Through the wire, Kip heard Reese's voice. Calm, measured. The tone of someone monitoring a situation that was still within expected parameters. Tracking active. Units moving. 2 minutes. Stay calm. But Emmett was already making a phone call. Put it on speaker, held it where Kip could hear. It's done. I've got the kid. Tell Jolene she's got 6 hours. Drop the custody case. Tell the judge she's unfit, give Harlon everything he wants. Or I kill the boy and leave his body where she'll find it. Harlon's voice came through the speaker, tinny but unmistakable. The same voice from the bar, recording but higher now, tighter, vibrating with the manic excitement of a man who believed he was winning. Make sure she knows you're serious. Hurt him. Send proof. That wasn't the deal. The deal changed. I want her broken Slayton. I want her to know what going against me costs. Hurt the kid. Take a picture. Send it to her. Emmett's jaw tightened. For the first time, something shifted behind the flat surface of his professional composure. Not hesitation, exactly. Something adjacent to it. A crack in the architecture that Kip was too frightened to identify, but the wire in his collar recorded with perfect fidelity. I'll handle it, Emmett said. You just make sure the money's ready when this is done. He hung up, drove in silence for 3 more minutes, pulled into a warehouse district on the eastern edge of the city. Dark buildings, empty lots. The kind of industrial area that existed during business hours and ceased to exist after dark, leaving nothing but concrete and metal and silence deep enough to swallow screaming. The warehouse was unlocked. Emmett led Kip inside, secured him to a support column with additional zip ties. The space was vast and empty and echoed every sound until the echoes became sounds of their own. Concrete floor, metal walls, no windows. A single overhead light that cast more shadow than illumination. Emmett stepped back, checked the bindings, looked at Kip for a long moment with an expression that had become more complex than the flat professionalism he'd worn like a mask since entering the motel room. How old are you? 11. You got family, sister? Foster care? I don't know where. Emmett nodded slowly. Something was working behind his eyes. Some calculation running against a ledger that Kip couldn't see, but the wire could hear in the changing rhythm of the man's breathing. I had a daughter, Emmett said. Vanessa. She was 9 when she died. Drive-by shooting. Bullet came through our apartment wall while she was sleeping. Wrong building, wrong floor, wrong night. Just like you at that truck stop. Wrong place, wrong time, and the universe decided she was acceptable collateral. He paused, stared at the gun in his hand like it was an artifact from someone else's life that had ended up in his possession by accident. Spent 12 years trying to fill the hole she left. Tried violence. Tried anger. Tried jobs like this one, telling myself that if I couldn't protect my own daughter, at least I could turn other people's pain into money. Thought if I stopped caring about anything, the empty space would stop hurting. It didn't, just made the hole bigger. Then why are you doing this? Kip's voice was small in the enormous space, swallowed by echoes and concrete and the weight of a conversation that had shifted from captor and captive to something stranger and more fragile. Because I'm good at it. Because people pay me. Because I convinced myself that there wasn't enough of me left to care about the difference between a job and a murder. His eyes focused on Kip with sudden clarity. But you know what's funny? The man who hired me, Harlon, he's a father too. Got a 7-year-old daughter he's trying to take custody of. Not because he loves her, because she's worth money. Because there's a trust fund with her name on it and he can't access it unless he's her legal guardian. Darcy, Kip said. Yeah, Darcy. Emmett's jaw muscles worked. The crack in his professional composure widened. And I was about to help him do it. Was about to kill a grandmother who's fighting to protect a little girl from a father who sees her as an asset on a balance sheet. Was about to do to Darcy exactly what someone did to Vanessa. Take away the person who loved her most. Let her grow up in a world where the last person who fought for her was gone. He stared at the gun, then at the door, then at the man tied to a column who was watching him with eyes too old for 11 and too young for everything they'd seen. The warehouse door opened. Not blown off its hinges, not kicked, open with the turn of a handle quietly by a woman who'd been listening through the wire from a vehicle 100 yards away and had driven to the warehouse the moment the GPS signal stopped moving. Jolene walked in alone, no weapon visible, no bikers behind her. Just a 58-year-old woman in a leather vest crossing a concrete floor with the measured stride of someone who was either supremely confident or beyond caring about the difference between bravery and recklessness. Emmett's gun swung toward her. Instinct. Training overriding whatever conscience had been whispering to him in the moments before she appeared. Let him go. Not a request, not a negotiation. A statement about what was going to happen next, spoken with the authority of someone who'd walked into worse rooms than this and walked out again. Emmett didn't lower the gun, didn't raise it either, just held it at the angle of indecision, caught between the professional who'd been paid to kill this woman and the father who'd been listening to himself describe his dead daughter to an 11-year-old boy and hadn't liked what he heard. "You were paid to kill a grandmother," Jolene said, voice steady, each word placed with the deliberation of stones being laid in a wall. "Look at this boy, 11 years old, lost his mother, lost his sister because nobody stood between her and the system that separated them. He's been sleeping behind dumpsters for 3 months, and the first thing he did when he saw someone in danger was run toward it instead of away." She paused. "Let that settle. You lost Vanessa to a bullet that came through a wall. A bullet that wasn't meant for her, fired by someone who didn't care who it hit. How many more children lose the people who love them before you decide you've been on the wrong side of that equation? I walk away from this and Harlon finds someone else." Emmett's voice was strained. "Someone who won't hesitate. Someone who won't have this conversation. Someone who kills you and probably the kid too just to clean up the mess. Then testify." Jolene took a step closer. "Give us Harlon, every payment, every conversation, every instruction he gave you. Trade what you know for a deal with the DA. Let the system put him where he belongs instead of letting him keep hurting people who can't fight back." Emmett laughed, bitter, the sound of a man confronting the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. "You think the system works? The system failed Vanessa, failed your granddaughter, failed this kid tied to a post in a warehouse at 2 in the morning. When has the system ever worked? When we make it work." Jolene's voice didn't waver. "When we give it evidence it can't ignore. When we stop waiting for someone else to fix things and start using every tool available, including the system as a weapon against people like Harlon." She took another step, close enough now that Emmett would have to make a conscious decision to shoot a woman who was looking him in the eyes with an expression that contained no fear and no hatred, and something that might, under different circumstances, have been called understanding. "I'm not asking you to trust the system. I'm asking you to look at this boy and tell me that a father who pays to murder his own mother deserves custody of a 7-year-old girl. I'm asking you to choose which side of Vanessa's story you want to spend the rest of your life standing on." Silence. Absolute. The warehouse swallowing every sound except the mechanical rhythm of Kip's breathing and the distant hum of the city that existed outside these walls but felt like it belonged to a different universe. Emmett looked at the gun, at Kip, at Jolene, at the geometry of the situation, the angles and trajectories and outcomes that his professional mind was computing with the speed and precision that had made him very good at a job he was now realizing had been slowly killing the parts of him that mattered. He lowered the gun, set it on the concrete floor, raised his hands. "All right." His voice was quiet, stripped of the flatness that had been its defining characteristic, something raw underneath, something that sounded like the first honest syllables he'd spoken in years. "I'll testify, I'll give you everything, but I want a deal, and I want to know the kid's going to be okay. The kid is under sacred protection. He's going to be more than okay." Jolene moved past Emmett, crouched beside Kip, started cutting the zip ties with the same knife that had opened the second shooter's arm at the truck stop, steel that served whatever purpose the moment demanded. "As for the deal, that's between you and the DA. But I'll tell them you chose the right side when it counted." She got Kip free, checked his wrists, checked his face, found fear and adrenaline in the particular exhaustion of a body that had been pumping survival chemicals for longer than anybody should have to. She pulled him into a brief, fierce hug. "Hard enough to hurt, hard enough to mean it. You did good. Recording's clean. We got Harlon ordering you hurt. We got Emmett admitting to the contract. We got everything." Kip's legs were shaking. Aftershock, his body catching up to what his mind had already processed. He leaned into Jolene's grip and let it anchor him the way her hand on his in the ambulance had anchored him, the way her presence through the motel wall had anchored him. Solid, real, not going anywhere. Jolene pulled out her phone, called Cormac. "Hearings in 7 hours. We deliver this evidence to the police and the DA right now. Rush the charges. Have Harlon in custody before the judge takes the bench. No judge in this state is going to award custody to a man facing conspiracy to commit murder charges." Cormac arrived with 4 bikers. They secured Emmett with zip ties that he accepted without resistance, Like a man who'd set down something heavy he'd been carrying for too long and couldn't remember how to pick it up again. Led him to the waiting vehicles. Dawn was already seeping across the horizon, pink and gold bleeding into the darkness like evidence of a world that still bothered to be beautiful even when the people living in it made that beauty difficult to justify. They drove to the police station. Jolene walked in carrying recordings, the note from the shooter's pocket, Emmett Slayton himself, and the particular authority of a woman who was handing the Albuquerque Police Department a case so thoroughly assembled that refusing it would require more effort than accepting it. Detectives moved fast once they understood what they were looking at. Warrants drafted, units dispatched, the machinery of law enforcement grinding to life with the reluctant efficiency of a system that functioned best when someone else did the investigation and handed it the results. Harlon Beckett was arrested at 6 in the morning in his girlfriend's bed, still carrying the residue of the night's chemical entertainment in his bloodstream. He didn't understand what was happening until they had him in handcuffs and were reading rights that he was too impaired to fully process. The look on his face captured by the arresting officer's body camera was not the expression of a man confronting justice. It was the expression of a man confronting the possibility that the world might not bend to his convenience after all. The DA filed charges by 7:30, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, kidnapping, child endangerment, a list of felonies that built on each other like bricks in a wall that would eventually rise high enough to block out the rest of Harlon Beckett's natural life. At 8:45, Jolene ran and walked into family court. Reese beside her carrying a briefcase full of evidence. Cormac waiting in the corridor because his presence in the courtroom would be counterproductive, but his presence in the building was a reminder that Jolene did not walk alone. The judge reviewed the police reports filed that morning, the charges against Harlon, the recordings that Jolene's legal team had submitted as emergency exhibits. Emmett Slayton's sworn statement dictated in a holding cell at 4 in the morning with a DA's office recorder capturing every word. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when every person in a room understands that the words about to be spoken will change the trajectory of lives that extend far beyond the walls containing them. Mr. Beckett's petition for custody is denied. The judge's voice carried the clipped precision of professional outrage held carefully in check. Ms. Beckett, you are granted full and permanent custody of Darcy Beckett, effective immediately. Mr. Beckett's parental rights are suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. This court extends its apologies for the distress this situation has caused your family. Jolene didn't cry, didn't celebrate, didn't allow the tidal wave of relief and exhaustion and vindication that was building behind her ribs to reach her face. She nodded once, professional, controlled, saving the emotional release for a time and place that didn't include judges and lawyers and court reporters documenting her reaction for the permanent record. Ellery Marsh met her in the hallway, face carrying the particular expression of a child protective services worker who had just watched a case resolve in a way that restored approximately 2% of her faith in the system she worked for. I'll have Darcy ready for pickup in 2 hours. She's been asking for you every single day. Told every adult in the foster home that her grandmother would come, that you always keep your promises. Jolene's throat tightened. She swallowed against it. Held. Tell her grandma's coming, and tell her I'm bringing someone she needs to meet. 2 hours later, Jolene pulled up to the foster home in a truck she'd borrowed from Cormac because the Harley wasn't designed for transporting children regardless of how much Darcy loved riding it. Kip sat in the passenger seat, stitches still visible at his collar, moving carefully the way people moved when their bodies were held together by thread and willpower and the stubborn refusal to stop functioning. The front door of the foster home opened, and a 7-year-old girl came through it at a velocity that suggested she'd been standing behind that door for 2 hours, waiting for the sound of an engine. She recognized the sight of a woman she'd been promised would return. Darcy Beckett hit her grandmother at full speed, arms wrapping around Jolene's waist with the desperate strength of a child who'd spent days wondering if love was something that could be taken away by strangers in suits. Face buried in leather and cotton, in the smell of engine oil and coffee, and whatever particular combination of scents meant grandmother and safety and home. Jolene caught her, held her, lifted her off the ground and pressed her face into that wild auburn hair and let the tears come because they were earned and because holding them back any longer would have required a strength she didn't have left. "I knew you'd come," Darcy whispered. "I told them. I told everybody." "You always keep your promises, always," Jolene said. The word carrying more weight than a single syllable should have been able to support. Loaded with 3 years of custody battles and one night of bullets, and every decision she'd made since a phone screen lit up with 3 words from a 7-year-old who just wanted to know when home was coming back. She set Darcy down, gently, kept one hand on the girl's shoulder. The other she used to gesture toward the truck, toward the boy sitting in the passenger seat, watching this reunion with an expression that contained more longing than an 11-year-old face should have known how to produce. "There's someone I want you to meet," Jolene said. "This is Kip. He's the boy who saved Grandma, and he's going to be staying with us for a while." Darcy studied Kip with the frank assessment that 7-year-olds specialized in. No social filters, no polite pretense, just direct observation and immediate conclusion. She saw the stitches at his collar, the careful way he moved, the jacket with the protection patch on its back, the eyes that were watching her the way someone watched a fire on a cold night, drawn to the warmth but not sure they were allowed to get close. "You got hurt saving Grandma." "Yeah," Kip said. "That was really brave. Your grandma's braver." "She saved me back." Darcy considered this equation for a moment. Then she walked to the truck, climbed up to the running board, and extended her hand with the solemn formality of a diplomat initiating relations between two nations that had never previously communicated. "Thank you for keeping her safe. I'm Darcy." Kip shook her hand, felt something shift in his chest. Not breaking exactly. Opening a door that had been sealed for 3 years, locked from the inside by a boy who'd learned that caring about people was a setup for losing them. "I'm Kip, and I've got a sister about your age. Maybe you can meet her soon." "I'd like that," Darcy said, with the simple certainty of a child who just decided that this person belonged in her world, and that was that. They drove back to Jolene's house, the one Harlon had tried to inherit, the one that would now hold a grandmother, a granddaughter, and a boy who'd earned his place in both their lives by doing the thing that nobody else had been willing to do. Jolene pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, sat for a moment in the sudden quiet hands on the wheel, looking at the house she'd fought for, at the life she'd defended, at the 2 children in her vehicle, who represented everything she'd nearly lost and everything she'd gained. Her phone buzzed. Text from Cormac. "Emmett's testimony is solid. DA offered him 15 years with possibility of parole at 10 if he cooperates fully. He took it. Harlan's looking at life without parole." Good, Jolene typed back. "And Kip's paperwork. Emergency guardianship is filed. You'll have temporary custody by end of week, permanent within the month if all goes well. Kid's legally yours until he ages out or you decide otherwise." Jolene looked at Kip, sitting in the passenger seat with Darcy already telling him about her school and her friends and the room that Grandma had painted purple because purple was the color of Queens. "You okay with this, living here, being part of whatever this is becoming?" Kip thought about the alternatives. The shelters, the dumpsters, the 3 a.m. cold, and the constant hunger and the exhaustion of never feeling safe. Thought about Norah still waiting in Santa Fe, about the possibility of a future that included more than survival. "Yeah," he said, "I'm okay with it." That night, Jolene made dinner. Real food on real plates at a table with chairs and napkins, and the overhead light casting warm yellow across a kitchen that smelled like garlic and bread, and the particular alchemy of someone cooking for people she loved. Darcy talked without pause, filling the house with the sound of a child reclaiming the space that fear had temporarily emptied. Kip ate quietly, listening, absorbing the strangeness of being somewhere warm and safe and wanted, of sitting at a table where his presence was expected rather than tolerated, of mattering. After dinner, after Darcy had been convinced that bedtime was not a conspiracy against her personal freedom, Jolene found Kip standing at the window of the spare room that was now his room, looking out at the dark street, at the city lights reflecting off low clouds, at a world that looked different from inside a house than it did from behind a dumpster. "Reese found your sister," Jolene said quietly. "Norah. She's in Santa Fe. Foster home run by a woman named Faye Dunlap. Been there 4 months, before that 6 different placements in 3 years. Kip's hand went to the window glass, palm flat against the cold surface. "Is she safe physically? Yes. Dunlap's record is clean. But Nora's been moved so many times she stopped trying to connect. Keeps to herself. Doesn't talk much. Classic pattern for kids who've learned that getting attached means getting hurt. He knew that pattern, had lived inside it, built it around himself like armor that protected and suffocated in equal measure. Can I see her tomorrow? After this is done, after we get the paperwork started, we drive to Santa Fe. All of us. We bring Norah into this. Same protection, same promise, same family. That was the deal. You help me, I help you. You promised. Jolene met his eyes. Steady, unyielding. I promise. And unlike most adults you've met, I keep my word. The oath works both ways, Kip. You save me, I save you back. That includes your sister. Kip nodded, didn't trust his voice. Turned back to the window and let the tears fall where nobody could see them, because some habits from the street died harder than others, and crying in private was one of the last ones to go. Behind him, Jolene stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching. Then she turned and walked to her own room, where a photograph of her late husband sat on the nightstand, Ray young and strong before the cancer. He'd made her promise. Take care of Darcy. Make sure Harlan's mistakes don't ruin another generation. Make sure the money he'd set aside would build a future instead of funding destruction. Promise kept, and expanded now to include a boy who'd saved her life and a sister who needed saving. Jolene turned off the light, let exhaustion pull her under. Tomorrow would bring Santa Fe and Norah and the complicated work of assembling a family from pieces that the world had scattered. Tomorrow would bring legal paperwork and healing wounds and trauma that didn't evaporate just because the immediate danger had passed. But tomorrow would also bring a sister reunited with her brother, would bring one more child pulled from the margins into a circle of protection that now numbered 927, would bring proof that sacred oaths meant something real and lasting and worth the cost of keeping them. For tonight, that was enough. The drive to Santa Fe took 2 hours. Jolene behind the wheel of Cormac's borrowed truck. Kip in the passenger seat with his hands clasped between his knees, pressing them together to keep them from shaking, a strategy that worked for approximately 30 seconds at a time before the trembling started again. Darcy in the back seat, legs too short to reach the floor, swinging her feet in a rhythm that had no connection to the radio or the road or anything except the internal metronome of a 7-year-old who processed the world through motion. What if Norah doesn't like me? Darcy's voice was small against the highway noise. She'd been asking questions since they left Albuquerque, each one a little more uncertain than the last, a child trying to map unfamiliar emotional territory without a compass. She'll like you, Kip said. The words came out with more hope than certainty. He hadn't seen his sister in 3 years. Didn't know what 6 foster placements and the accumulated weight of being unwanted had done to the girl who used to wear a purple hoodie for 3 straight weeks because their mother said it was the color of Queens. Didn't know if she'd forgiven him for disappearing, for being the brother who stood in a doorway and did nothing and then vanished from her life entirely. Jolene glanced at him, read the tension in his shoulders and jaw, the rigid posture of someone bracing for an impact that hadn't arrived yet. Reese talked to Norah's foster mother, she said. Told her you were coming. Norah's been packed since yesterday morning. Sitting by the window, waiting. She remembers me. She's been waiting for you for 3 years, Kip. Children don't forget that. They carry it. Sometimes it turns into anger, sometimes into hope. Either way, it means you mattered. The house was in a quiet Santa Fe neighborhood where lawns stayed trimmed and front porches held rocking chairs and terracotta pots with plants that someone remembered to water. Middle-class ordinary. Faye Dunlap met them at the front door, 60-something with kind eyes set in a face that had been softened by years of caring for children who arrived broken and left still cracked, but perhaps a little more whole. She had the careful weariness of a woman who understood that love wasn't always enough to repair what the world had damaged, but believed it was worth offering anyway. She's upstairs, Faye said. Been nervous all morning. Kept asking if you were real. If this was another promise somebody made and forgot about. Kip's chest constricted. Can I see her? Go ahead. Second door on the right. He climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt like it covered more distance than the 12 inches of wood and carpet beneath his feet. Like he was crossing years instead of stairs, traversing the gap between the brother who'd frozen in a doorway and the brother who'd taken a bullet in a parking lot and he didn't know which one would be standing in that doorway when Norah saw him. The door was half open. He knocked anyway. Gentle, giving her the time he wished someone had given him. "Come in." Her voice hit him with a force that had nothing to do with volume. 3 years older, but still Norah. Still carrying something in her vowels that sounded like their mother's kitchen on Saturday mornings before Croy, before everything shattered. He pushed the door open. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, 11 years old now, hair longer than he remembered, darker, pulled back in a ponytail that looked like she'd done it herself without a mirror. Eyes that had gained an edge they hadn't carried in the photograph he'd kept in his backpack for 3 years. She was wearing clothes that fit but looked temporary, assembled from whatever the current placement provided. Nothing personal, nothing chosen, nothing that said, "This is mine and I plan to stay." A small backpack sat at her feet. Everything she owned compressed into one bag, ready to move at a moment's notice because moving was what foster children did. You learned to keep your life portable so that when the next disruption came, and it always can say shanim, you could pick up and go without leaving anything behind that would hurt to lose. They looked at each other, brother and sister separated by 3 years and 1,000 miles of damage. Neither sure how to bridge a gap that silence had been widening since the night their world split in half. "You got tall," Norah said finally. "You got old," Kip replied. A smile crossed her face, brief flickering the muscle memory of happiness activating for half a second before caution shut it down. "You said you'd come back for me. I know. I'm sorry it took so long. 3 years isn't long." There was no accusation in her voice. Just fact, the flat, undecorated truth of a child who'd learned to state things as they were because hoping they'd be different was a luxury that got revoked early. "I couldn't before," Kip said. "But I can now, and I'm not leaving without you." Norah studied him, took in the stitches still visible at his collar, fading but present, the stiffness in his movements that spoke of a body still negotiating with a wound, the denim jacket with its protection patch stitched onto the back, marking him as someone who belonged to something larger than himself. "Reese told me you got shot, saved someone's grandmother." "Yeah." Well, the question was bigger than the word. It contained 3 years of wondering why her brother hadn't saved their mother, why he hadn't stopped Croy, why he disappeared into a system that swallowed children whole and rarely bothered to check if they survived the digestion. "Because I was tired of standing still," Kip said. "Tired of watching bad things happen and doing nothing. Tired of being the kid in the doorway who couldn't move when it mattered." He paused, met her eyes, let her see the truth without decoration. "I wanted to prove I could be different. That freezing in that kitchen wasn't the whole story of who I am. I don't know if it worked, but I've got people now. A grandmother who keeps her word, a little girl who needs looking after, 900 bikers who decided I was worth protecting." He stopped. "And a sister I've been looking for since the day they took you away. If you'll come with me." Norah picked up her backpack, held it against her chest, shield and security blanket, and the physical manifestation of a life designed for leaving. "We're Albuquerque. Jolene's house. She's got a room for you. Emergency guardianship papers for both of us. We'd be together, not just blood, choice. Family that showed up when it mattered. What if it doesn't work? What if she decides we're too much trouble? What if she sends us back the way everyone else did?" Kip understood the fear because it still lived inside him too, whispering in the quiet moments, insisting that permanence was a fiction adults invented when they wanted something from you. "Then we figure it out together. But Jolene isn't like the others. She called in a sacred oath for me. 927 people drove through the night because I took a bullet for her. Those are people who follow through." Norah stood, testing the decision in her legs before committing to it with her heart. "Is Darcy nice?" She's 7. Talks constantly, shares everything she owns. Thinks brothers who save grandmothers are heroes. You're not a hero, I know. But maybe I can be a brother who doesn't freeze next time." Something shifted in Norah's expression. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall she'd built, just wide enough to let possibility squeeze through. They went downstairs together. Norah moving with the controlled caution of someone who'd learned that showing excitement was a setup for disappointment. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs and saw Darcy standing by the front door, something happened that neither sibling expected. Darcy smiled, wide and open and completely unaware that some people needed time before they could accept a smile at face value. You're Norah. Kip talks about you all the time. I'm Darcy. Do you like motorcycles? Because Grandma has one and it's really loud, but also really cool. And sometimes she lets me sit on it. And if you ask nice, maybe she'll let you sit on it too. Norah blinked, looked at Kip for translation. She's always like this, he said. I like motorcycles, Norah said quietly. Never been on one. Then we'll fix that. Jolene stepped forward from the hallway, not crowding, leaving Norah space to breathe, to assess, to decide for herself whether this woman was safe. I'm Jolene. Diesel on the road. I've got a house with 2 spare rooms and a kitchen that actually has food in it. No promises except this one. You're under protection now. Same as Kip, same as Darcy. Nobody hurts you without going through us. And us is 927, give or take, depending on the day. Norah looked at the woman in the leather vest, at the patches and the scars on her knuckles, and the gray threading through dark hair. At the 7-year-old pressed against her grandmother's leg, with absolute confidence that this person was safe and good and permanent. At her brother standing beside them with stitches in his side and something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in 3 years. Hope, fragile and stubborn and refusing to die no matter how many reasons the world provided. Faye appeared with paperwork, emergency placement transfer, temporary guardianship authorization, signatures and stamps that transformed Norah from a case number in a filing cabinet into a member of a household that hadn't existed a week ago. Her medical records, school files, therapy notes. Faye handed the folder to Jolene. She's been through 6 homes in 3 years. Each one made it harder. She'll test you, push every boundary you set, try to prove that you'll quit the way everyone else did. I won't quit, Jolene said. Everyone says that. I'm not everyone. They drove back to Albuquerque. Darcy filled the silence with stories about school, about her best friend, who had a dog named Biscuit, about how Grandma once let her steer the motorcycle in the driveway, and it was the greatest moment in the history of moments. Norah listened from the back seat, didn't speak, watched the desert scroll past the window, and kept her backpack on her lap with both arms wrapped around it. Kip watched his sister in the rearview mirror, recognized the posture, the held breath, the way she kept her body angled toward the door, always ready to exit, always measuring the distance between herself and the nearest escape route. He'd held himself that same way for years, might still be holding himself that way if a bullet hadn't forced him into a different posture entirely. The house felt different with 4 people in it, fuller, louder, more complicated in ways that were both wonderful and terrifying. Jolene showed Norah her room, plain walls, empty dresser, clean sheets on a bed that didn't smell like anyone because foster homes learned not to let rooms accumulate the personal scent of children who wouldn't stay. You can decorate however you want. Paint the walls, hang posters, put up pictures. Make it yours. This isn't temporary. Norah set her backpack on the bed. Didn't unpack. How long? As long as you want. I've filed for permanent guardianship. If it goes through, you're with me until you're 18. Unless you decide otherwise. People always say permanent and then something changes. Jolene sat on the edge of the bed, slow, non-threatening, leaving 3 feet of space between them. You're right. Things change. I'm not going to promise you perfect because perfect doesn't exist in any house I've ever lived in. What I can promise is that I won't send you back because you're difficult. Won't give up because you test me. Won't decide one morning that you're too much work. You're Kip's sister. He saved my life. That makes you family, and I protect family even when family makes it hard. That's a strange reason to take in somebody's kids. Most reasons people bring kids into their homes are strange if you examine them honestly. Jolene stood, left the room, gave Norah the privacy to sit with whatever she was feeling and decide for herself whether opening that backpack meant hope or just another rehearsal for the disappointment that would follow. Kip found her an hour later, still on the bed, backpack still closed. You don't have to unpack, he said, not until you're ready. What if I'm never ready? Then you live out of a backpack, but you live here while you do it. Norah looked at him, really looked, taking inventory of the changes that 3 years and a bullet had made. The height he'd gained, the angles his face had developed, the scar tissue forming beneath his shirt, where the entry wound was still deciding what shape it would carry for the rest of his life. Did it hurt getting shot? Yeah. Was it worth it? Kip considered the question against the evidence. This house, this room, Jolene in the kitchen making dinner, Darcy's voice carrying through the hallway narrating her life to anyone within earshot. His sister 3 feet away, still guarded, still braced, but here, present, reachable for the first time in 3 years. Yeah, he said, it was worth it. Dinner was the particular awkwardness that all new families endured. Too much politeness layered over too little familiarity. Darcy did the heavy lifting, filling silence with stories and questions, and the relentless optimism of a child who believed that people sitting around a table eating food together meant everything was going to be fine. Jolene asked careful questions, received careful answers. Norah ate slowly, watching the door between bites, cataloging exits, doing the survival math that foster children performed automatically in unfamiliar environments. But she ate, and when Jolene mentioned dessert, Norah's eyes widened for half a second before she caught herself and smoothed the reaction into neutral. A flash of surprise that kindness could include chocolate cake, that unexpected good things didn't always carry a price tag that arrived later. That night, Kip heard crying through the wall, soft, muffled. The sound of someone who'd learned to grieve quietly because loud grief in foster homes attracted attention that was rarely helpful. He knocked on Norah's door, waited, go away. He opened it anyway, found her curled on the bed in her closed backpack clutched against her chest, face wet. I used to cry every night for the first month, he said, after they took you, after I ran from Croy. Thought if I cried enough, something would change, that someone would hear and decide to care. Nothing changed. So why are you telling me this? Because eventually I stopped. Stopped crying, stopped feeling, went numb, because numb was easier than hoping. Lived like that for almost 3 years. Then I met Jolene and Darcy and people who decided I was worth something. And it hurt Norah. Feeling again, hoping again, letting people in when every part of me was screaming to stay closed. In some ways it hurt worse than the bullet. Norah sat up, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Does it get easier? I don't know. I've only been doing it for a week. But we're doing it together this time. That has to count for something. She leaned against him. Small gesture, enormous meaning. Brother and sister reunited by a gunshot and an oath, and a grandmother who decided that protecting one child meant protecting them all. They sat in the dark, not fixing anything, just proving with their presence that neither of them was alone anymore. 6 weeks passed. Some days felt like progress. Some felt like retreat. Time doing what time did in households built from broken pieces, revealing the cracks, while simultaneously filling them with the slow accumulation of shared meals, shared mornings, shared space. Kip's stitches came out. The wound became a scar, raised in pink permanent, evidence of the night he'd stopped running away and started running toward. He began working at Cormac's garage 3 days a week after school, learning that his hands could build engines and repair brake lines and create order from mechanical chaos. Learning what it meant to be expected somewhere to have someone notice when he didn't show up. Norah tested boundaries with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an experiment whose hypothesis was that all adults would eventually abandon you. She stayed out past curfew, skipped school, refused to eat dinner at the table, left her backpack packed for the first 2 weeks, a signal that as she could leave at any moment, that this arrangement was provisional, that she hadn't committed because commitment was for people who hadn't been burned. Jolene didn't crack, didn't raise her voice, didn't issue ultimatums or threats or any of the responses that Norah's behavior was designed to provoke. When Norah stayed out until 2 in the morning, Jolene stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the light on so that when Norah walked through the door, expecting confrontation, she found something worse: patience, consistency. A woman who said, I was worried, and meant it without attaching consequences. When Norah skipped school, Jolene drove her personally the next morning, walked her to the entrance, said have a good day, and drove away without lecturing. When Norah screamed that she hated this house and everyone in it and wanted to go back to foster care, where at least nobody pretended to care, Jolene said okay and made dinner anyway. Slowly, incrementally, in steps so small they were almost invisible. Norah's backpack got unpacked. Clothes migrated from the bag to the dresser. A drawing went up on the wall, then another, then a third. She started eating at the table without watching the door. Started laughing at Darcy's stories quietly at first, then with actual sound. Started calling Jolene by name instead of avoiding direct address entirely. Started believing that maybe this time the floor beneath her wouldn't give way. The morning Croy Renner reappeared was a Tuesday in November. Ordinary in every way that mattered until it wasn't. Jolene's phone rang at 11 in the morning, Norah's school. The voice on the other end belonged to the vice principal, and it carried the particular tension of an administrator dealing with a situation that had exceeded the boundaries of school policy. Ms. Beckett, there's a man here claiming to be Norah Renner's legal guardian. He's requesting to remove her from school. Norah is extremely distressed. She's locked herself in the counselor's office and won't come out. Jolene was in her truck within 30 seconds, phone wedged between her shoulder and ear as she pulled out of the driveway. His name. What's his name? Croy Renner. He has documentation. Ms. Beckett, he's insistent. Do not release her to him. Do not let him near her. I'm 12 minutes away. Call the police. She hung up. Dialed Reese while driving. Croy Renner is at Norah's school, trying to take her. I need everything you have on his legal standing right now. Reese's keyboard was already firing. Croy Renner. He was never formally stripped of guardianship. Mother's deceased biological father unknown. On paper, he's still Norah and Kip's legal stepfather. Emergency guardianship gives you temporary custody, but it doesn't terminate his parental rights. If he challenges in court, he's not challenging in court. He's standing in a school lobby trying to physically remove an 11-year-old who's terrified of him. Jolene called her lawyer next, got voicemail, left a message that was 3 sentences long and contained more urgency per word than most people generated in a paragraph. Then she called the one person who could meet her at the school in time. Kip answered on the second ring. He was at Cormac's garage halfway through an oil change. Croy's at Norah's school. Silence. 2 seconds, then the sound of a wrench hitting concrete. I'm coming. Not on a bike. You're not legal to ride alone. Get Cormac to drive you. And Kip, listen to me. Do not confront him physically. Do not touch him. Do not give him anything he can use. We handle this clean or we don't handle it at all. She got to the school in 10 minutes, parked in the fire lane because parking regulations were not among her current priorities. Walked through the front entrance with her shoulders set and her breathing controlled and every nerve in her body tuned to a frequency that most people never accessed outside of genuine emergencies. Croy Renner was standing in the administrative office. 40s, average height, soft around the middle in a way that suggested beer rather than food. Wearing clean clothes and a reasonable expression, the costume of a concerned parent navigating bureaucracy assembled carefully over whatever he actually was underneath. Jolene had known men like him, had been married to one a lifetime ago. Men who could put on respectability the way other people put on jackets, wearing it just long enough to get what they wanted before the real person underneath pushed through. He turned when she entered, saw the vest, the patches, processed and recalculated. Who are you, Jolene Beckett? Norah's guardian. Temporary guardian. I'm her legal stepfather. I have documentation. He held up papers. Jolene didn't look at them. Looked at him instead. At his eyes. At whatever lived behind the reasonable expression in the clean shirt. You're the man who beat their mother badly enough to put her in the hospital. Who waved a gun at a social worker while 2 children watched. Whose violence caused its CPS to remove Norah from her home and placed her in a system that failed her 6 times before she landed with me. That's not, Croy started, and you're the man Kip ran from. At 11 years old, he climbed out a window in January because staying in your house was more dangerous than sleeping on the street. He spent nearly 3 years homeless rather than live with you. What does that tell you about your fitness as a parent? Croy's reasonable expression thinned. Jolene saw the real face beneath it. The anger that men like him kept leashed in public and released in private behind closed doors against people who couldn't fight back. I've changed, he said. Got counseling. Got clean. I have a right to my children. They're not your children. They're your dead wife's children, and you lost any claim to them when you put her in the hospital. The door behind Jolene opened. Kip walked in. Cormac had dropped him at the curb, was waiting in the truck outside. Not bikers filling the building. Not leather and chrome and intimidation. Just a 14-year-old boy walking into a school office to stand next to the woman who'd promised his sister would be safe. Kip positioned himself between Croy and Moore, which used to be Croy, and the hallway that led to the counselor's office where Norah was locked inside. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence was the message. 3 years ago, he had been frozen in a doorway. Now he was standing in one by choice, blocking it with his body and his intention and the absolute refusal to let this man near his sister again. Croy looked at Kip. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the realization that the boy who'd been too scared to move was no longer a boy and was no longer scared and was no longer alone. 2 police officers arrived. Jolene's call to the school had triggered protocol, and the officer's presence shifted the dynamics from a custody dispute into something with rules and witnesses and documentation. Jolene turned to the officers. She spoke clearly, audibly, with the measured precision of someone building a legal record with every word. This man has a documented history of domestic violence against these children's mother. Kip Renner, who I have emergency guardianship over, was returned to this man's custody by CP 3 years ago and fled due to ongoing abuse. I have medical records, police reports, and sworn testimony documenting his violence. I'm requesting an emergency restraining order, and I'm informing you that if he is not removed from this school immediately, I will file charges for harassment, intimidation, and attempted interference with illegal guardianship. She turned to Croy. And I'm informing you that I have retained legal counsel, that a petition to permanently terminate your parental rights was filed this morning, and that any further attempt to contact Norah or Kip will be treated as a violation of the protective order that will be in effect by end of day. She'd filed the petition that morning. Had been working with her lawyer for weeks since the day Norah arrived, anticipating exactly this scenario, building the legal architecture that would seal Croy out permanently, not waiting for him to come, preparing for when he did. Croy looked at the officers, at Jolene, at Kip standing in the doorway, at the situation he had walked into, expecting a scared girl and an overwhelmed school administration, and finding instead a woman who'd prepared for his arrival with the same strategic thoroughness she'd used to dismantle his stepson's father. "You can't do this," he said, but the conviction had drained from his voice. He was reading the room, understanding that the power dynamics he'd relied on, the physical intimidation, the legal gray areas, the assumption that nobody would fight back, had been systematically eliminated before he'd even known to look for them. The officers escorted him out. Jolene watched him go, watched the doors close behind him, watched the threat recede, not with the dramatic finality of a confrontation resolved by force, but with the quiet procedural efficiency of a system being used as the weapon it was designed to be. She found Norah in the counselor's office, curled in a chair with her arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. Eyes wide with the particular terror of a child confronted by the monster she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Jolene crouched in front of her. Didn't touch, didn't crowd, just put herself at eye level and spoke. "He's gone. Police took him. Restraining order by tonight. Petition to terminate his rights is already filed. He doesn't get near you again. Not today, not ever. How can you be sure? Because I've been preparing for this since the day you moved in. Because I don't wait for problems to find me. I find them first, and I take them apart before they reach the people I care about." Norah stared at her, processing, recalibrating everything she'd believed about adults and promises and the reliability of protection. "You knew he'd come. I knew someone like him would try. They always do. Men who hit think they own the people they've hurt, but ownership requires consent, and neither you nor Kip ever gave him that." Kip appeared in the doorway. Norah saw him, saw the brother who'd come, who'd stood in the gap between her and danger without hesitation, without freezing, without repeating the failure that had haunted them both for 3 years. "You didn't stand still," she said. "I had someone standing with me this time." That night after dinner, after Darcy had been tucked into bed, after the house settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Norah unpacked her backpack. Kip watched from her doorway as she placed each item in the dresser with the careful deliberation of someone performing a ritual they'd never attempted before. Clothes folded and arranged. Drawings taped to the wall with adhesive strips Jolene had left on the nightstand without comment. A photograph of their mother positioned on the shelf above the bed where it could be seen from the pillow. And the backpack itself empty, now tucked into the closet. Not beside the bed, not within arm's reach. In the closet where things were stored when you planned to stay. Harlan's trial came 4 months after his arrest. Jolene and Kip both testified. Emmett Slayton testified for 3 hours, detailing every payment, every instruction, every conversation with a specificity that left no room for the jury to construct reasonable doubt. The defense attorney tried to paint Jolene as the aggressor, as a woman whose biker affiliations made her the true danger to Darcy. The attempt collapsed under the weight of evidence that included Harlan's own voice ordering a child harmed. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Life without parole. Jolene sat in the gallery and watched her son receive a sentence that would consume the remainder of his natural life. She felt the weight of it settle over her. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something heavier and more complicated than either. The particular grief of a mother who had failed to save her child from himself and was now watching the consequences of that failure measured in decades. She didn't cry. Not there. Saved it for the drive home, for the stretch of highway between the courthouse and the exit for her street, where she pulled onto the shoulder and let the sound come out of her. Raw and private and belonging to no one except a woman who'd buried a husband and lost a son and was now raising 3 children in a house that she'd once thought would be too quiet after Ray died. The ceremony happened on a Saturday in late spring, desert outside Albuquerque. Open skin and red earth stretching to the horizon in every direction, the landscape that had been the backdrop for everything that had changed in the past 6 months. 927 motorcycles parked in formation. Chrome reflecting the early sun, a bonfire burned at the center large enough to see from miles away. Old tradition, fire as witness, fire as transformation. Cormac stood beside the flames. Full patch, scars and authority, and the particular gravity of a man whose word had been tested enough times to prove that it held weight. He raised one hand and the assembly went silent. Brothers and sisters, we gather to honor a sacred obligation. 6 months ago, Jolene Beckett calling this oath. A boy named Kip Renner took a bullet meant for her, saved her life, saved her granddaughter's future, did what most wouldn't, stood when he could have stayed down. Jolene walked forward, leading Kip and Norah and Darcy. 4 people assembled by violence and choice into something that functioned like a family because it had chosen to be one. Cormac continued, in our world, these oaths are permanent. They mean someone outside our brotherhood did something that wove their life into ours, that their protection became our responsibility. Their family, our family. He pulled out a patch, black leather embroidered with a lioness in gold thread. Words beneath it. Grandmother Lion, Jolene Beckett. You didn't just survive. You turned the protection of a homeless boy into protection of his sister. You fought a custody battle and won. You stood in a warehouse alone and turned a killer into a witness. You used strength when strength was needed and law when law was needed, and you never once confused the two. This patch isn't just for fighting, it's for building what comes after the fight. He held it out. Jolene turned. Let him sew it onto her vest, each stitch deliberate. When she faced the assembly, 927 people stood in unison. Hands rose to chests. No applause, no noise, just silence, which in this world carried more respect than any sound. Cormac turned to Kip. Second patch, silver thread, a lion's head in profile. Words beneath, Lionheart protected. Kip Renner, 11 years old, homeless, nobody's responsibility. You saw a gun and screamed, took a bullet for a stranger, helped bring down a man who wanted his own mother dead, reminded every one of us what courage looks like when it's stripped of everything except the choice to move. He held the patch out. Kip took it. Jolene helped him turn, sewed it onto the denim jacket that had once belonged to Reese's dead brother. Thread binding fabric to fabric passed to present one loss to one rescue. For Norah, a smaller patch. Simple design. Text only. Under protection, Renner family. You didn't ask for this, Cormac said. Didn't choose it. But your brother fought to bring you here, and Jolene opened her home. That makes you one of ours. Same promise. Same shield. Norah looked at Kip, at Jolene, at Darcy, who was standing on her toes trying to see over the adults around her, completely certain that everything happening was right and good and exactly how the world was supposed to work. She took the patch, let Jolene sew it on, stood among 900 strangers who'd decided she mattered before she'd decided they were worth trusting. When the patches were placed, the assembly broke its silence. Applause, shouts, whistles. the sound of people celebrating survival and family, and the stubborn insistence that some oaths meant something permanent. Jolene stepped to the bonfire, flames painting her face in shifting amber, voice carrying across the desert without amplification. They tried to kill me, to use my granddaughter as currency. They thought I'd break. They were wrong. They thought I'd be alone. Wrong again. She looked at the assembly. Kip taught me that courage spreads. One voice screaming in the dark can wake 900. Darcy taught me that children are watching us, learning from what we do when it counts, not from what we say when it's easy. Her voice shifted, quieter, carrying the weight of something she'd been building in her mind for months. I'm not just a grandmother anymore. I'm not just a biker. I'm the start of something that needs to exist. There are grandparents all over this country raising children because the parents can't or won't, fighting custody battles without money for lawyers, fighting systems that don't recognize them as viable, fighting alone because nobody told them there was help. She pulled out a folder, held it up. The Grandmother Lion Project, legal aid for grandparents in custody battles, safe houses for emergency placements, a network built on the reach we already have. Bikers and lawyers and social workers connected by the same principle that brought 900 of you here today. We protect. We show up. We make sure the vulnerable aren't standing by themselves. Cormac took the folder. Read it, looked at the assembly. All in favor, 927 hands rose. Unanimous. We'll build it, Cormac said. Fund it, staff it, make it last. Close to 3 years passed. The Grandmother Lion Project helped its first family within a month of the ceremony. A 70-year-old woman fighting for custody of twin granddaughters whose father was using them as cover for a dealing operation. Jolene showed up with lawyers the Brotherhood funded and bikers who made it clear that threatening grandmothers carried consequences. The woman got custody, the twins got stability. Word traveled. By the end of the first year, 37 families. By the second, 114. Grandparents who'd been fighting alone discovered that a network existed, that someone would answer when they called. That protection meant people showing up, not just promises made from a safe distance. Kip turned 14, worked at Cormac's garage full-time outside school hours, learning mechanics and welding, learning that reliability was something you built with your hands and your presence day after day, that people counted on him and he could be counted on. Norah found art, drew the family that had assembled itself around her, Jolene on her Harley, Darcy with her gap-toothed grin, Kip with his scar fading but visible beneath his collar. 900 bikers rendered as a sea of chrome and leather surrounding the people who mattered. Her teacher submitted the drawings to a statewide competition. She won. The prize included a scholarship fund for art school, a future opening in directions that foster care files had suggested were statistically unlikely for someone with her background. Darcy turned 10, confident and loud and absolutely certain that the world could be good because the people around her had proven it. She started a junior chapter of the Grandmother Lion Project at her school. Kids helping kids, collecting donations, spreading awareness. 9 years old when she began it, 10 when it became real, already understanding that protection required action. Jolene turned 60, gray hair going white, joints that filed complaints after long rides, but still riding, still showing up for custody hearings and emergency placements and the endless unglamorous work of proving that family meant showing up. 187 children in permanent custody with grandparents. 43 women connected with safe houses and legal aid. The program spreading across 7 states, each chapter anchored by bikers who decided that the most dangerous thing they could do was care about people the system had overlooked. On a Tuesday night in autumn, Jolene got the call. Unknown number. She answered because she'd learned that unknown numbers sometimes carried the voices of people who needed help and had run out of other options. Ms. Beckett, this is Officer McKenzie with the Tucson Police Department. We've got a 14-year-old boy here, homeless, says he found the Grandmother Lion Project online, wants to know if it's real, if anyone actually comes. Jolene looked at the kitchen, at Kip doing homework at the table, at Norah sketching in her notebook, at Darcy building something elaborate from materials that hadn't been designed to go together, but were cooperating anyway under the force of a 10-year-old's will. Her family. Built from wreckage and refusal and the stubborn belief that some debts were worth spending your whole life repaying. "I'll be there in 6 hours," she said. "Keep him safe until I arrive." She hung up, looked at the three of them. "Got a call. Kid in Tucson needs help. I'm riding out tonight." Kip stood before she'd finished the sentence. "I'm coming with you. You've got school tomorrow, and you've got a 6-hour ride alone in the dark. I'm coming." Norah looked up from her notebook. "Me too. You hate long car rides. I hate a lot of things. Doesn't mean I let you do them alone." Darcy appeared with her backpack already on her shoulders. "Road trip." Jolene looked at them, at what they'd become, at what she'd become. Not just a grandmother, not just a biker. Something harder to name but easier to recognize. A woman who'd been broken and broken again, and rebuilt again, and had decided somewhere along the way that the rebuilding was the point. "All right," she said. "Let's go remind someone they're not alone." They drove through the night, desert dark and star-filled and stretching in every direction like a promise that had no end. Jolene at the wheel, Kip navigating, Norah drawing in her notebook by the dome light, Darcy asleep against Norah's shoulder dreaming whatever 10-year-olds dreamed when they'd grown up believing the world was worth trusting. Somewhere in Tucson, a 14-year-old boy was sitting in a police station holding a phone number he had found on a website, wondering if the promises he'd read were real or just another fiction adults constructed to make themselves feel better about a world that chewed up kids and forgot to check what happened after. Jolene Beckett was 6 hours away and closing the distance. Behind her, built from one scream in a parking lot and one bullet and one oath that 927 people had decided to keep a network stretched across 7 states. Bikers and lawyers and social workers and grandparents and children. Connected by the principle that showing up mattered more than standing back. That protection was something you did every single day with your hands and your time and your presence. She thought about Kip at 11 exploding out of the shadows behind a dumpster because he couldn't stand the silence anymore. About Darcy running out of a foster home and into her arms with the faith of a child who'd never been given a reason to doubt. About Norah unpacking her backpack for the first time, placing each item in a dresser with the terrified precision of someone betting everything on the hope that this time would be different. About 927 engines rumbling to life in a hospital parking lot because someone called and said this matters. About a note on blood-smeared paper that had tried to end her life and instead created something that would outlast all of them. Her phone buzzed. Text from the boy in Tucson, 2 words. "You coming?" She typed back with one hand, eyes on the road, the other hand steady on the wheel. 20 minutes. Hold on. And she drove. Through the darkness and the distance and the hours, toward another child who needed proof that when you called for help, someone came. That when you'd been overlooked long enough to forget what being seen felt like, there were people in the world who would look at you and say you matter now, and mean it, and prove it, and never stop proving it for as long as proving it was required.